Ever since the earliest rockets, we've seen them working with a bell-shaped engine nozzle. From the first German V2 rockets right up until the SpaceX Falcon Heavy. But the ubiquity of the bell-shaped rocket nozzle doesn't mean to say that it's the best way to do things. In fact, they have a major drawback, which is one of the reasons why we use multi-stage rockets.
Curious droid.
However, since the early 1970s, there has been an alternative rocket engine which has much greater efficiency and was to power the next generation of single-stage-to-orbit spacecraft to replace the space shuttle. But if it's so good, why hasn't it even been flown yet? The engine in question is the Aerospike, a design that goes back to the 1950s when it was first developed by Rocketdyne. Now, whilst this might sound like an exotic new type of propulsion, the Aerospike is not actually a whole new engine. It's actually just a different way to contain and control the thrust that any rocket, be that liquid or solid fuel, produces, and it replaces the Bell-type combustion chamber. Now, if we've been using the Bell-type rocket nozzle combustion chamber since the very first rockets, right up until now, then what's wrong with them? For a rocket to work correctly and produce enough thrust to lift it into orbit, then you have to control the burning rocket fuel. If there was no rocket nozzle, then the burning rocket fuel would just expand uncontrollably in all directions, and very little of it would be converted into useful thrust. What the rocket nozzle does is convert the high-pressure combustion of the rocket fuel into an ultra-high-speed flow of gas exiting the nozzle in one direction and at atmospheric pressure. The ratio of the size of the narrow end to the wide end of the nozzle must also allow for the atmospheric pressure where the rocket will operate. Now, this sounds complicated, but it's actually quite simple. Everything, including you, me, the ground, and rocket engines, have atmospheric pressure pressing on us in all directions due to the weight of the atmosphere as the air is pulled down by the Earth's gravity. If you imagine a column of air measuring 1 square inch or 2.54 square centimeters from sea level to the top of the atmosphere, that air would have a mass of 6.67 kilograms or 14.7 pounds. We don't feel it because we have evolved to live at that pressure. But if you were to go up to 12 kilometers, that pressure would be just 1/10 of sea level. And at 50 kilometers, it will be 1/100th of sea level, simply because the column of air is now much shorter and thus weighs much less. That air pressure also pushes on the gases exiting the rocket nozzle. For a rocket to work at its most efficient and produce the most amount of thrust, the gases exiting the rocket nozzle must be at atmospheric pressure so that they exit out as straight as possible. This is fine if your rocket is travelling sideways through the atmosphere like an air-to-air missile. Then the air pressure doesn't change much. A rocket going into orbit, however, starts at sea level with a lot of air pressure and ends up in a vacuum with no air pressure. Because a Bell nozzle has a fixed shape and size, its maximum efficiency and thrust will only be achieved at one altitude. Design it to have maximum thrust at sea level, take off, and the exhaust gases will overexpand and lose thrust at high altitudes because of the lack of air pressure. Design it to have maximum thrust at high altitudes. Take off, the air pressure is so much that it constricts the gas flow inwards, which leads it to separating from the nozzle wall and becoming unstable, usually resulting in the engine blowing up. In an ideal rocket nozzle, it would change its shape as the altitude and air pressure changes. This is what an aerospike does. It uses the pressure of the air surrounding it to have the same effect as the bell of a traditional rocket engine. The two main types of aerospikes which have been developed are the annular, or round ones, and the linear, or straight ones. The round ones are where we get the name from. If you imagine an inverted bell shape, it becomes a round spike. This spike becomes one side of a virtual bell, whilst the air pressure surrounding it compresses the exhaust gas against the inner spike, although many now use a truncated spike, which has a much shorter design than the equivalent engine bell. As the rocket goes from takeoff at high air pressure to the low air pressure at high altitudes, the shape of the exhaust flow changes due to the changing air pressure to keep it at optimum shape and optimum thrust. This is what's called an altitude compensating rocket nozzle. Although it might not be as efficient as a bell at any given altitude, it outperforms them at all others. The space shuttle main engines, which were used from takeoff to space, were much less efficient at sea level than they were in space. With a rocket engine like the aerospike, you could use just one engine that would work efficiently from takeoff to space and avoid the need for multiple stages with different rocket engines optimized for different altitudes, effectively becoming an SSTO, or single stage to orbit. So, if these are so good, why aren't they used? To date, no major rocket launches have used an aerospike, despite much research and development being done during the 1960s and 70s and then in the 1990s. As a follow-on to the successful J2 engine, which was used on the Saturn third stage, Rocketdyne set about developing and building both toroidal and linear aerospikes using the turbo pumps and engine infrastructure of the J2. One of the biggest problems with an aerospike engine is the cooling of the spike. In the toroidal or round design, the spike is long and heavy, which makes it difficult to cool the tip of the spike to stop it from melting. This was mostly overcome with the development of a new copper alloy called Nalloy Z in the 1970s, which allowed longer use at high temperatures. The design was also changed with a truncated spike, with some of the exhaust gases being passed through the centre to achieve a similar result to the long spike but with much less mass. However, the linear version was even more flexible. In this, the round spike is straightened out into a V shape with the combustion chambers on either side. The beauty of this design is that it can be made modular, so that it can have more combustion chambers added to make a longer and more powerful engine. Back in the 70s, they used combustion nozzles made into small banks, which were stacked side by side on both sides of the V centre. Although aerospikes were proposed for the space shuttle, as the Apollo program was wound up in the early 1970s, development work on the aerospikes also stopped, and the space shuttle went on to use conventional Bell engine nozzle designs. Things stayed pretty much like this for the next 20 years until NASA was looking to develop the next generation of space shuttle using an all-new single-stage-to-orbit design. The design brief was to be able to come up with a completely new launch vehicle that would be fully reusable and would greatly reduce the cost of getting into space from $10,000 per pound to $1,000 per pound. Lockheed Martin won the contract to build the revolutionary design designated the X-33, and one of the key features was the use of the linear aerospike engines. Development work continued on the XRS 2200 linear aerospike, and by now, with the use of electromechanical nozzles, it meant that the fuel system could be controlled on a nozzle-by-nozzle basis, a bit like the fuel injection on a car. This allowed for much greater throttling control and allowed for thrust vectoring by turning off different sections of the engine. This also removed the need to have heavy, complex engine gimbals. Work progressed well up until 2001, when due to issues with the X-33's composite fuel tank and cost overruns, the project was cancelled, again taking the aerospike engines with it. Progress has been made with NASA testing small-scale solid rockets with a toroidal full-length aerospike in 2004, but since then there have been no large aerospike engine developments. So why don't new companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin use the aerospike engines with all the efficiencies they bring? Wouldn't they be the perfect match for a low-cost route to space? As far as we know, SpaceX has looked at using aerospikes, but given the fact that no large-scale aerospike has ever been flight tested, it would be a very big risk when you're looking to set up a commercial orbital space company. One of the driving principles of the space race was to do the job good enough and no more. Basically meaning that once you have developed your spacecraft or your rocket engine to do what it was designed to do, then that's it. You stop there. The technology SpaceX and others are using is well known and tested. The way they use it might be different, like relighting the main engines to descend back to Earth, but the engines themselves are a known quantity. Commercial companies have to make a profit in the end, and taking on a major task like developing a new, untested engine design is something that could quickly sap those profits away. Although the X-33 project almost got them to flight testing, it's still new technology and needs more money and more development. It would also mean completely redesigning the rockets away from tried and trusted, but yet limited, traditional bell nozzle engines. All this takes time which could be used launching with traditional engines and getting money into the companies. Although there would be a saving of up to 40%, the fuel is actually one of the cheapest parts of a rocket launch. Elon Musk said himself that the Falcon 9 cost $60 million to build, but only $200,000 for fuel. The bringing back of the boosters and the central core with the engines brings far greater savings than could be achieved with the change to aerospike engines. It seems as though until the price of launches has been driven down to as low as conventional bell nozzle engines will allow, aerospikes will remain the drawing board. The single stage-to-orbit vehicles, which perfectly complement the aerospike's capabilities, seem a long way off since the cancellation of the X-33, and the renewed interest in returning to the moon using variations of conventional engines date back to the early 1960s. There are smaller companies like Arcaspace, which are developing small-scale aerospike engines for single-stage-to-orbit satellite launches. But unless there is a radical change in the space market, only time will tell if aerospikes will ever get used for future space vehicles. So what does it take to design a rocket engine? How much thrust does it take to lift a spacecraft, and how fast must we launch an object from the surface of the Earth to get it to leave? You can look up the answer if you want. If you're like me, then you want to create things by yourself. Our sponsor for this video, Brilliant.org, is dedicated to doing just that, turning you into a living, breathing, and most importantly, calculating scientist. Head on over there and prove for yourself just what it takes to get a rocket into orbit. Having a strong math and science skill set is crucial because it opens up so many ways to explore the universe. To support Curious Droid and learn more about Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/Curious Droid and sign up for free. So, if you're ready to launch off a planet, the first 200 people will get 20% discount off of the annual premium subscription. Ever since the earliest rockets, we've seen them working with a bell-shaped engine nozzle. From the first German V2 rockets right up until the SpaceX Falcon Heavy. But the ubiquity of the bell-shaped rocket nozzle doesn't mean to say that it's the best way to do things. In fact, they have a major drawback, which is one of the reasons why we use multi-stage rockets.
Curious Groin.
However, since the early 1970s, there has been an alternative rocket engine, which has much greater efficiency and was to power the next generation of single-stage to orbit spacecraft to replace the space shuttle. But if it's so good, why hasn't it even been flown yet?
This episode of Real Engineering is brought to you by Blight, a problem-solving website that teaches you to think like an engineer. If you've been on the internet in the past month, you have probably seen a picture of Elon Musk's latest project, a rocket that looks like the brainchild of a H.G. Wells fever dream of the future. It doesn't look like any current generation rocket by any shape or measure. It's shorter and fatter than your typical SpaceX rocket, and most strange of all, it's made of stainless steel, a material that has largely fallen out of use for propellant tanks since the 60s. Steel is strong, but it's pretty heavy, making it unsuitable for flight structures. Reducing the weight of the launch vehicle is an art form in rocket science. Every kilogram matters, and engineers have come up with some innovative ways to reduce weight. WD-40 was originally developed to displace water, which is where its name came from, to protect the metal tanks of the Atlas rockets from rusting, because they weren't painted to save weight. Those Atlas rockets were made of stainless steel. In those days, aluminium alloying material science hadn't quite developed far enough, and the engineers of the Atlas rockets instead opted to use extremely thin stainless steel for their propellant tanks, varying from 2.5mm to about 10mm. These were essentially metal balloons, as they were structurally unstable when unpressurized. In one infamous case on May 11, 1963, an Atlas Agena D lost pressurization on the launch pad, allowing the weight of the upper stage to buckle the thin steel. Pressurization adds strength to pressure vessels, as the pressure provides a restoring force for small deformations. So, if the metal attempts to bend inwards, the internal pressure pushes it back out. This strengthens all rocket tanks, allowing their thickness to be minimized. But this application took it to the extreme to make up for steel's density. Our choice of material for aviation and aerospace applications has evolved with our mastery of material science, specifically with the materials available to us that have the highest strength-to-weight ratios. We can visualize these strength-to-weight ratios on a graph like this, plotting the strength of the material against its density. Looking at this, it's pretty clear that steel adds a significant amount of weight while not adding a proportional amount of strength. Steel is typically 2.5 times heavier than aluminium, but it is not 2.5 times stronger. So why use stainless steel? Well, strength-to-weight ratios are not the only factor engineers have to consider. Something you may not consider are things like thermal conductivity. Aluminium has a much higher thermal conductivity than steel, and thus can conduct heat from its surroundings into the cryogenic fuel much faster. This can vaporize the fuel, which requires boil-off valves to vent the vaporized fuel. To minimize this problem, rocket fuel tanks are often sprayed with foam insulation. That's what gave the external tank of the space shuttle its distinctive orange color. But this adds a substantial amount of mass itself, which in turn decreases the weight-saving benefits aluminium provides. However, the Falcon 9 fuel tanks are not insulated. To prevent major boil-off of the fuel is loaded as late as possible. This reduces the amount of fuel that will be vaporized, but also makes the job of getting the Falcon 9 certified for human payloads a bit of a nightmare. NASA did not want SpaceX to fuel the rocket with passengers on board, because, as we saw earlier, things can go wrong during that phase. In August 2018, they finally approved the Falcon 9 for this load-and-go style of fueling for human flight. The aluminium-lithium alloys used in the Falcon 9 were not developed until the late 50s and early 60s, which increased their strength-to-weight ratios, allowing their introduction to aerospace applications. The stainless steel balloon tanks of the Atlas rockets were eventually made with this aluminium alloy metal, and their strength-to-weight ratios were boosted by using a unique stringer pattern called an isogrid, which boosted the aluminium's ability to resist buckling, like that of the Atlas Agena D. NASA performed these huge compressive buckling tests on the aluminium-lithium tanks of the SLS rocket. Typically, you use little strain gauges whose electric resistance changes as you stretch them, forcing the electrons along a longer path to keep track of the strain in the material. But for something this big, they would have needed thousands. Instead, they painted dots all over the structure to allow computer imaging software to keep track of the strain. That isogrid structure is excellent for maximizing strength while minimizing the material needed. It is essentially an interwoven pattern of I-beams that increase the stiffness of the overall structure. You will see this pattern everywhere in aerospace, from these 60s era rockets to SpaceX's new Dragon 2 capsule. SpaceX to date has used aluminium-lithium alloys in their propellant tanks, but they opted not to use this isogrid structure. Even though it provides fantastic strength or weight performance, it is absurdly expensive to manufacture. To manufacture isogrids, you start off with a thicker piece of aluminium and machine it down using a CNC machine. This results in about 95% of the material going to waste. Instead, SpaceX opted for a thin skin of aluminium-lithium alloy and then stir-welded strengthening stringers in place. We are constantly balancing a huge number of factors. Here, the cost of manufacturing the rocket influenced its design. Typically, the cost of launching an extra kilogram of material to space far outweighs the cost of material. But in cases like this, the waste in manufacturing process can influence material choice. For example, Musk attributed the cost of carbon fiber composites as one of the primary reasons he abandoned it as a material for the Starhopper. Carbon fiber composites cost about $135 per kilogram, and a significant amount of that is thrown away in the layup process. The manufacturing process for carbon fiber composites is extraordinarily expensive and difficult. As explained in my carbon fiber video, carbon fiber composites gain all of their strength from the long and thin carbon fibers inside the plastic resin that holds them together. This means that their strength is not the same in all directions. And in order to ensure the material can be strong in all directions, you have to layer your carbon fiber composite in a very specific way. You then have to cure it in a pressurized oven. This was one of the major flaws I pointed out in predicting the failure of the early prototypes of the BFR carbon composite tanks, which were made in two parts, presumably because they couldn't find tooling and an autoclave big enough to cure a full-sized tank. Being perfectly honest, this is the only subject area where I have enough expertise to make comments on other people's designs, and I was surprised SpaceX was pursuing the material at all, for the reasons stated above, and as it's unsuitable for a vehicle that not only has to withstand the freezing temperatures of the cryogenic fuel on ascent, but the scorching temperatures of re-entry. Not once, but twice, as this will be the first vehicle in history expected to visit Mars and return. Here we really start to see where stainless steel shines and why Musk is opting for a stainless steel vehicle. Let's plot another graph, this time plotting strength against maximum operating temperature. Here we can see that stainless steel outperforms both aluminium alloys and carbon fiber composites by a significant margin. The Falcon 9 first stage serves only to boost the second stage to about 65 to 75 kilometers in altitude and between 6,000 and 8,300 kilometers per hour, before flipping over and performing re-entry burns to slow down before entering the thicker atmosphere at relatively slow speeds. Even then, the engine nozzles, which are designed to tolerate massive temperatures, take the brunt of the re-entry heating, allowing the aluminium tanks to avoid any major re-entry heat. This is not how the Starhopper is intended to work, because it is being built as an interplanetary vehicle. The Starhopper can expect to enter the Martian atmosphere at speeds of up to 21,000 kilometers per hour and experience temperatures up to 1,700 degrees. Well above the maximum service temperature of both aluminium and stainless steel, but we have ways of leaching some of that heat away before it can heat the metal. The Curiosity rover utilized a phenolic impregnated carbon ablator, which is extremely light, has a low thermal conductivity, and can resist extreme temperatures of up to 1,930 degrees. But nothing this heavy has entered the Martian atmosphere before, and it's not going to be an easy task for it to slow down. It's going to have to enter the Martian atmosphere at an extremely high angle of attack to allow the thin Martian atmosphere to sap away speed through drag for an extended period. But drag comes with heat. Stainless steel may be heavy, but it will require significantly less heat shielding than an aluminium or carbon fiber composite, once again closing that weight advantage gap of these alternate materials. In fact, Musk has stated that the rear side of the Starhopper will require no heat shielding at all, and he plans to use a strange technique to cool the wind-facing side of the vehicle. using the same method humans use to cool down, by sweating. Musk plans to pump liquid methane between two steel panels on the windward-facing side of the SpaceX rocket, where it will gain heat, vaporize, and evaporate through small holes in the rocket's surface. This is a pretty weird way of cooling a ship, and I wondered why you would not just opt to use the tried and true method of a blade of tiles. Then I remembered that this ship needs to make a return journey, and the entry into the Martian atmosphere will damage the tiles and require maintenance. There is no oil on Mars to manufacture new phenolic resin or the carbon needed for ablatives, so using methane, the fuel the new Raptor engines that SpaceX will use for the Starhopper, makes a lot of sense. It reduces the equipment the rocket will need to carry to Mars, making the rocket significantly lighter. They can just use the equipment they already needed for refueling, making it double purpose. They just need to mine water and extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then do some fancy chemistry to produce methane and oxygen. The prototype they are building at the moment is likely just to test the manufacturing techniques needed to build it and test its flight capabilities. This ship does not need to be space-worthy, it just needs the same weight, center of gravity, and shape to allow SpaceX to test it. On the surface though, the whole operation looks like a bit of a shit show, and I really try to be positive about engineering advancements, but the thing literally fell over in the wind last week. I'm really curious on how this whole thing is going to unfold. Sometimes you just need to make mistakes to learn, which is why you should sign up to Brilliant. Brilliant recently introduced a new feature called Daily Problems, which will present you with interesting scientific problems to test your brain, like this one that will teach you how solar sails allow spacecraft to gain speed without rocket fuel. If you answer a question wrong, like I did here, it teaches you exactly why, allowing you to learn from your mistakes. Brilliant even have an app that you can download to play these brain teasers on your morning commute. Each daily problem provides you with the context and framework that you will need to tackle it, so you can learn the concepts by applying them. If you like the problem and want to learn more, there's a quiz course that explores the same concept in greater detail. If you are confused and need guidance, there's a community of thousands of learners discussing the problems and writing solutions. Daily problems are thought-provoking challenges that will lead you from curiosity to mastery, one day at a time. So what are you waiting for? Go to brilliant.org/real engineering and finish your day a little smarter. And the first 500 of you to do so will get 20% off the annual subscription to view all problems in the archives. As always, thanks for watching, and thank you to all my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see more from me, the links to my Instagram, Twitter, Discord server, and subreddit are below.
Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. I'm here at SpaceX's brand new launch facility in Boca Chica, Texas, to check out the holy grail of rocket engines, and that's SpaceX's upcoming Raptor engine. An engine like this has never actually been used on a rocket before. Now, this is a methane-powered, full-flow, staged combustion cycle engine. Talking about a rocket engine that's this complex can be really intimidating. And in order to put it into context against other engines and other engine cycles, we're gonna do a full comparison of the Raptor engine versus a bunch of other engines, including SpaceX's current workhorse, the Merlin engine, against the RS-25, the Space Shuttle main engine, the F-1 engine that powered the Saturn V, the RD-180, and Blue Origin's BE-4 that also runs on methane. And as if the full-flow staged combustion cycle wasn't enough, SpaceX is also doing something else unique. They're powering that thing with liquid methane. And that's something that's actually never been done on an orbital class rocket. So we're gonna take a look at the characteristics of methane and see if we can figure out why SpaceX chose methane instead of any other common propellant. Now, this engine isn't really the best at anything. It's not the most powerful, it's not the highest thrust to weight ratio of any engine, it's not even the most efficient, but it does a lot of things really, really well. So by the end of this video, hopefully we'll have all the context to understand why the Raptor engine is special, how it compares to other rockets, why it's using liquid methane, and then hopefully we'll know if it really is the king of rocket engines. Let's get started.
3, 2, 1.
Now, in case you didn't notice when you clicked on this video, this is a very, very long video. Sorry, not sorry. But if you're anything like me, you keep hearing a lot of hype about the Raptor engine, and you want to appreciate it, but you don't even know where to start. Well, I've spent quite a while really studying up on the subject, so I can lay down a good foundation in order to help us really, truly, fully appreciate the Raptor engine. Well, and quite frankly, all rocket engines. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've stared at diagrams like this, or like this, or like this one, for hours until you feel like your head's going to explode. So in order to avoid that, I've actually whipped up some really simple versions of rocket engine cycles for all of us to enjoy, which will hopefully help us grasp these crazy concepts. But in case this isn't your first rodeo, here's the timestamps if you want to jump to a certain section. There's also links in the description to each section, as well as an article version of this entire video at my website, everydayastronaut.com, in case you want to study some of the numbers a little more in depth or see sources of some of the material. Now, we're gonna start off with a super quick physics lesson, but bear with me. We're gonna dive in and get plenty of nitty-gritty details. Okay, so let's start off with this. Rockets are basically just propellant with some skin around it to keep it in place, and they have a thing on the back that can throw said propellant really, really fast. And to way oversimplify it even more, the faster you can throw that propellant, the better. Now, the easiest way to do this is by storing all the propellant in your tanks under really high pressure. Then put a valve on one end of the tank and a propelling nozzle that accelerates the propellant into workable thrust. Done. No crazy pumps or complicated systems, just open a valve and let her rip. This is called a pressure-fed rocket engine, and there's a few main types: cold gas, monoprop, and bipropellant pressure-fed engines. You'll often find these used in reaction control systems because they're simple, reliable, and they react quickly. But pressure-fed engines have one big limiting factor. Pressure always flows from high to low, so the engine can never be higher pressure than the propellant tanks. In order to store propellant under high pressure, your tanks will need to be strong and therefore thicker and thicker and heavier. Look at composite overwrapped pressure vessels, or COPVs. They're capable of storing gases at almost 10,000 psi or 700 bar. And despite this, there's still a limited amount of propellant and pressure they can store. And this does not scale up very well when you're trying to deliver a payload to orbit. So smart rocket scientists quickly realized in order to make the rocket as lightweight as possible, there's really only one thing they could do: increase the enthalpy. That would be a great metal band name. You're welcome, Internet. Enthalpy is basically the relationship between volume, pressure, and temperature. A higher pressure and temperature inside the combustion chamber equals higher efficiency, and more mass shoved through the rocket engine equals more thrust. So in order to shove more propellant into the engine, you could either increase the pressure in the tanks, or just shoot the propellant into the combustion chamber with a really high-powered pump. The second option sounds like a pretty good idea. But pumps moving hundreds of liters of fuel per second require a lot, and boy do I mean a lot, of energy to power them. So what if you took a tiny rocket engine and aimed it right at a turbine to spin it up really, really fast? You could exchange some of the rocket propellant's chemical energy for kinetic energy, which could then be used to spin these powerful pumps. Welcome to turbopumps and the staged combustion cycle. But you've still got some limiting factors here, like how high pressure always wants to go to low pressure, and how heat has that habit of melting stuff. So you've got to keep all these things in check while trying to squeeze every bit of power out of your engine. Now, there's actually a lot of different variations of the cycles that we could talk about, but I'm going to stick with the three most common, or at least the three that matter the most when putting the Raptor into context. We have the gas generator cycle, the partial flow staged combustion cycle, and lastly, we'll look at the full flow staged combustion cycle. And perhaps in a future video, I'll try and do a full rundown of all liquid-fueled rocket engines, including fun new alternatives like the electric pump-fed engines seen on Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. So let's start with the gas generator cycle, known as the open cycle. This is probably one of the most common types of liquid-fueled rocket engine used on orbital rockets. It's definitely more complicated than a pressure-fed system, but it's fairly simple, well, at least compared to their closed cycle counterparts. Now, I'm gonna way oversimplify this so it's as easy to grasp as humanly possible. In real life, there's literally dozens of valves, a hive of wires, and extra tiny little pipes everywhere, helium to back pressure the tanks, fuel flowing through the nozzle and the combustion chamber to cool it, and there's an ignition source for the preburner and the combustion chamber. But again, for the purpose of making this as simple and as digestible as possible, just know there's a lot of stuff missing from these diagrams.
But for now, we're just gonna focus on the flow of these engines so we can grasp that concept first. The gas generator cycle works by pumping the fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber using a turbo pump. The turbo pump has a few main parts: a mini rocket engine called the preburner, a turbine connected to a shaft, and then a pump or two that push propellant into the combustion chamber. Now you might hear the turbo pump assembly called the power pack, because it really is what powers the engine. In the open cycle system, the spent propellant from the preburner is simply dumped overboard and does not contribute any significant thrust. This makes it less efficient since the fuel and oxidizer used to spin the pumps is basically wasted. Now the funny thing about a turbo pump is that it kind of has a chicken and egg syndrome situation that makes it pretty difficult to start up, since the preburner that powers the turbo pump needs high pressure fuel and oxidizer to operate. So the preburner requires the turbo pumps to spin before it can get up to full operational pressure itself, but the turbo pumps need the preburner to fire in order to spin the turbo pumps, but the preburner needs the turbo pumps to... yeah. You can see where this is going. This makes starting a gas generator pretty tricky. There's a few ways to do this, but we don't need to get into all that in this video. That sounds like a fun topic for future videos though. So back to the turbo pumps. Remember, pressure always flows from high to low. So the turbo pumps need to be a higher pressure than the chamber pressure, and this means the inlets leading to the preburner is actually the highest pressure point in the entire rocket engine. Everything else downstream is lower pressure. But notice something here. Take a look at SpaceX's Merlin engine, which runs on RP1 or Rocket Propellant 1 and liquid oxygen. Notice how black the smoke is coming out of the preburner exhaust. Why would it be so sooty compared to the main combustion chamber, which leaves almost no visible exhaust? Well, that's because rocket propellant can get super hot, like thousands and thousands of degrees Celsius. So to make sure the temperature isn't so hot that it melts the turbine and the entire turbo pump assembly, they need to make sure it's cool enough to continually operate. Running at the perfect fuel and oxidizer ratio is the most efficient and releases the most energy, but it also produces a crazy amount of heat. So in order to keep the temperatures low, you can run the preburner at a less than optimal ratio. So either too much fuel, known as fuel rich, or too much oxidizer, or oxygen rich. Running an RP1 engine fuel rich means you'll see some unburnt fuel appearing as dark clouds of soot. The highly pressurized unburnt carbon molecules bond and form polymers, which is a process known as coking. This soot starts to stick to everything it touches and can block injectors or even do damage to the turbine itself. So what if you didn't want to waste all that highly pressurized propellant? I mean, after all, since it's running cooler by being fuel rich, doesn't that mean there's a bunch of unburned fuel literally being wasted? What if you could just pipe that hot exhaust gas and put it into the combustion chamber? Huh? Welcome to the closed cycle. The closed cycle or staged combustion cycle increases engine efficiency by using what would normally be lost exhaust and connects it to the combustion chamber to help increase pressure and also increase efficiency. So let's take the Merlin engine and try closing the loop. Let's take the exhaust and just pipe it straight into the combustion chamber. Uh-oh. Oh no! We just put a bunch of soot and clogged all the injectors. You do not go to space today, my friend. But there's a few solutions to this problem, so let's see how the Soviets solved it. The first operational closed cycle engine they made was the NK-15, designed for their N-1 moon rocket. They later upgraded it to the NK-33, and then many versions from there stemmed out, including the RD-180, which is what is used on the Atlas V today. Since the NK-15 and NK-33 runs on RP1 like the Merlin, you can't run your preburners fuel rich because of the coking problem. So if you want to create a closed cycle engine with RP1, the answer is running the preburner oxygen rich. Easy as that, right? Well, now you're blasting superheated, highly pressurized gaseous oxygen, which will turn just about anything into soup, right at your precision machined, crazy low tolerance turbine blade. Doing so is actually considered impossible by the United States, and they basically gave up on trying. They didn't think a metal alloy existed that could withstand these crazy, crazy conditions. And they didn't believe the Soviets had made such an efficient and powerful RP-1 powered engine until after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the US engineers got to see them and test them out firsthand. But the Soviets had indeed worked their butts off, and they had made a special alloy that can magically, with science, withstand the crazy conditions of an oxygen-rich preburner. With a closed cycle engine, you don't just use some fuel and some oxidizer, and burn that in the preburner to spin the turbine, you actually shoot all of the rich propellant through the turbine. So with an oxygen-rich cycle, all of the oxygen actually goes through the preburner and just the right amount of fuel goes to the preburner. You only need enough to give the turbine the right amount of energy to spin the pumps fast enough to get the right pressures for the preburner and the combustion chamber to make the right amount of power to shoot the thing into space. Just crazy. So back to this oxygen-rich preburner. That now hot gaseous oxygen is forced into the combustion chamber where it meets liquid fuel. They meet and go boom, and we get a nice, clean, and efficient burn without really wasting any propellant. But still, like all engines, the chamber pressure cannot be higher than the pump pressure, so the pumps actually have a lot of weight on their tiny little metal shoulders. Now, if you're sitting there thinking that the United States just sat back and let the Soviets have all the closed cycle glory, you'd be wrong. It took the United States a little bit longer, but they eventually figured out a closed cycle engine. But it was very different from the oxygen-rich cycle. The United States pursued a closed-loop cycle, but they went with a fuel-rich preburner. But wait, we just learned that fuel-rich preburner's exhaust is so sooty that it pretty much ruins anything, right? Well, sure, if you're using RP1 or any other carbon-heavy fuel, that's definitely going to be the outcome. So the United States went with a different fuel, hydrogen. Okay, so now we've avoided the problem of blasting crazy hot, high-pressure oxygen at anything dear and precious. But now we've opened up a new can of worms. Hydrogen is significantly less dense than RP1 or liquid oxygen. It's so much less dense, it takes a huge and really complex turbopump to flow the right amount of hydrogen into the combustion chamber. Since RP1 and LOX are relatively similar in density and in ratios, they can be run on a single shaft using a single preburner. Because of this, the engineers at Rocketdyne pursued an engine known as the RS-25, which would go on to power the space shuttle. They realized that because of the large difference between the pumps, they might as well have two different preburners. One for the hydrogen pump and one for the oxygen pump. So that's what they did. But having two separate shafts created another new problem. Now engineers were putting high pressure, hot gaseous hydrogen on the same shaft right next door to the liquid oxygen pump. If some of that hydrogen would leak out of the preburner, it would start a fire in the LOX pump, which is catastrophically bad. Hydrogen is also very hard to contain because it's so not dense. Undense. Lightweight. It likes to sneak through cracks and get out anywhere it can. So engineers had to make an elaborate seal to keep the hot hydrogen from sneaking out. The seal required for this is called a purge seal, and it's actually pressurized by helium, so that it's the highest point of pressure. So if the seal leaks, it just leaks inert helium. It's genius. But take a look at how different the LOX turbopump and the hydrogen turbopump seals look. You can tell how much more engineering time and effort had to go into the hydrogen seals. I mean, the people that think of this stuff are nuts. The RS-25 is still considered to be about the best engine ever made, with a fairly high thrust-to-weight ratio and unmatched efficiency. Okay, now that we've talked all about the dual preburner, fuel-rich RS-25, here's a simplified diagram of that. Now, I didn't bother making the fuel pumps different sizes, and I just want to focus on the flow here and help make that as simple as possible. But do note, both preburners of the RS-25 run fuel-rich. So although they might look the same, they power different pumps. And I'll just let this run here for a few seconds so you can study it for a bit. But don't worry, we'll also put all these up on screen at the same time once we cover them all. So the closed cycle improves the overall performance of the engine and is highly advantageous. So how can it get any better than this? We're finally ready to talk about the full flow stage combustion cycle, which basically just combines the two cycle methods we just talked about. With the full flow stage combustion cycle, you take two preburners, one that runs fuel rich and one that runs oxygen rich. The fuel rich preburners powers the fuel pump and the oxygen rich preburner powers the LOX pump. This means the full flow stage combustion cycle needs to tackle the oxygen rich problems, which again is solved by developing very strong metal alloys. So SpaceX developed their own super alloys in-house that they named SX500. According to Elon Musk, it's capable of over 800 bar of hot oxygen-rich gas. That may have been one of the biggest hurdles in developing the Raptor engine. Luckily, the fuel-rich side only pumps fuel, so if some of that hot fuel leaks through the seal on the shaft, it just comes in contact with more fuel, which is kind of no big deal. So no need for one of those really elaborate seals. Full flow likely wouldn't work with RP1 due to the coking problems with a fuel-rich preburner. But other fuels are still valid to use this design. But more on that in a minute. The advantage of this system is that since both the fuel and the oxidizer arrive in the combustion chamber as a hot gas, there's better combustion and hotter temperatures can be achieved. There's also less of a need for that crazy sealing system as we mentioned earlier. And that's definitely a good thing when you plan to reuse your engine over and over with little to no refurbishment between flights. And lastly, because there's an inherent increase in mass flow, or how quickly all the propellant is shooting into the preburner, the turbines can run cooler and at lower pressures because the ratio of fuel and oxidizer needed to spin the turbo pumps is much lower. And think of it this way. In an open cycle, you only want to use as little fuel and oxidizer as possible in the preburner since it's all wasted. And you want it to be as hot as withstandable to make it more efficient. But with the full flow cycle, all of the fuel and all of the oxidizer goes through the preburners, so you can burn just exactly as much propellant as necessary to power the turbo pumps. But the cool thing is, your fuel to oxidizer ratios will be so crazy fuel rich and crazy oxygen rich that the temperatures at the turbines will be much lower, and this means longer lifespans for the turbo pump assembly. It also means more combustion happens in the combustion chamber and less in the preburner. Now here's the crazy part. Only 3 engines have demonstrated the full flow stage combustion cycle. Ever. In the 60s, the Soviets developed an engine called the RD-270, which never flew, and in the early 2000s, Aerojet and Rocketdyne worked on an integrated powerhead demonstrator called, wait for it, the Integrated Powerhead Demonstrator, which again never made it past the test stand. And the third attempt at developing a full flow stage combustion cycle engine is SpaceX's Raptor engine. Ta-da! That's right. The Raptor engine is only the 3rd attempt at making this crazy type of engine. It's the first to ever do any type of work and leave a test stand. And fingers crossed, it'll be the first full flow stage combustion cycle engine to reach orbit. Well, actually, just about anything this engine does will be a first. This means SpaceX had to tackle some crazy problems. I mean, not only that same problem that plagues oxidizer-rich cycles, like having to have a really strong metal alloy, they also had to learn how to control, 2 different preburners and 2 different cycles to create the highest pressures of any chamber pressure ever. They just beat the RD-180's record of about 265 bar when they hit 270 bar, and they're not even done. They're hoping for 300 bar inside the combustion chamber. That's nuts, and we'll talk more about that in a second.
But before we move on, now that we've done a rundown on all these engine cycle types, let's put them all up on screen and let them run for a bit so you can watch each one and compare them side by side. I know for myself, it helps a lot to see them all together on the same screen at the same time.
Since the Raptor engine can't run a fuel-rich preburner using RP1, you'd think the next most logical choice would be hydrogen. Well, SpaceX didn't opt for either RP1 or hydrogen, they went with liquid methane. So now we finally have another topic to touch on. Why did SpaceX choose liquid methane for the Raptor engine? What are the qualities that make it advantageous over hydrogen or RP1? To date, no liquid methane, or otherwise known as methalox engine, has gone to orbit. So what qualities does it have that make it desirable? Let's take a look at methane compared to RP1 and hydrogen. Let's put methane in between RP1 and hydrogen. You'll see why here really quickly. So let's start off with perhaps the biggest factor when designing your first stage, the density of the propellant. Having a denser fuel means the tanks are smaller and lighter for a given mass of fuel. A smaller tank equals a lighter rocket. So here's the density of these 3 fuels measured in grams per liter. In other words, how much does 1 liter of this stuff weigh, or really what's its mass? Starting off with RP1, 1 liter is around 813 grams. RP1 is 11 times more dense than hydrogen, which is only 70 grams per liter, and methalox is right in the middle at 422 grams per liter. Remember how airships or zeppelins used to be filled with hydrogen to make them lighter than air? Well, that's because hydrogen is so much less dense than our atmosphere. It makes for an excellent, albeit really flammable gas for a balloon. I mean, we all remember the Hindenburg, right?
It should also be noted that 813 grams per liter is an average for RP1, but SpaceX chills their RP1 in their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy for about a 2 to 4% increase in density. But historically, RP1's density is right around that 813 grams per liter. So in the case of density, methane is kind of right in the middle of the two others. But there's more to it than just density. We also need to take into consideration the ratio of how much fuel is burned compared to how much oxidizer is burned. This is the oxidizer to fuel ratio. So here's where things get a little more interesting and the tables turn just a little bit. Rocket engineers have to take into account the mass of the fuel and the corresponding weight of the tanks. So they don't actually burn propellant at the perfect stoichiometric combustion ratio. They find the perfect happy medium that balances tank size with thrust output and specific impulse. Let's look at the mass ratios for fuel and oxidizer that the engineers have come up with. So for these numbers, RP1 is burned at 2.7 grams of oxygen to 1 gram of RP1. Hydrogen burns at 6 grams of oxygen to 1 gram of hydrogen, and methane burns at 3.7 grams of oxygen to 1 gram of methane. These numbers can now help offset a little the massive difference in density. So let's visualize this to help make it easier to digest. Liquid oxygen is 1,141 grams per liter. It's a little more dense than RP1. So burning LOX and RP1 at a 2.7 to 1 ratio, for every liter of LOX, you'd need a little over half a liter of RP1. Next up, let's do hydrogen. Now with hydrogen being 11 times less dense than RP1, you'd think it'd need a tank that's 11 times bigger. But luckily, engineers have found that it pays to burn LOX and hydrogen at a 6 to 1 ratio for a good compromise. This means for each liter of LOX, you'd need 2.7 liters of hydrogen. So your fuel tank needs to be approximately 5 times larger compared to RP1. So yeah, that helps. That's why when we look at a hydrogen-powered Delta IV versus an RP1-powered Falcon 9, you can see the fuel tank is much smaller than the LOX tank on the Falcon 9, but the Delta IV is about the opposite. The LOX tank is much smaller than its fuel tank. So now let's take a look at methane. This one gets kind of interesting. LOX is 2.7 times more dense than liquid methane, but the burn ratio is 3.7 grams of oxygen to 1 gram of methane. So you need 0.73 liters of methane for every liter of LOX. In other words, your fuel tank would need to be about 40% bigger for methalox than it would need to be for RP1, despite RP1 actually being almost twice as dense. And compared to hydrogen, its fuel tank would be about 3.7 times smaller. So the fuel to oxidizer ratio helps make a methane fuel tank a lot closer to an RP1 tank than it is to a hydrogen tank. Another huge variable with any rocket engine is how efficient it is. This is measured in specific impulse or ISP, but you can think of it kind of like a fuel economy of a gas-powered car. So a high specific impulse would be similar to a high mile per gallon or kilometer per liter. The best way to think of specific impulse is to imagine you had 1 kilogram of propellant. For how many seconds can the engine push with 9.8 newtons of force? The longer it can sip on that fuel while still pushing that hard, the higher its specific impulse, and therefore the more work it can do with the same amount of fuel. So again, kind of like its fuel economy. So the higher the specific impulse, the less fuel it takes to do the same amount of work, which is a good thing. A fuel-efficient engine is extremely important. And now, due to the molecular weight of each fuel and their energy released when burned, there's a different potential for how quickly the exhaust gas can be expelled out the nozzle. This means each fuel has a different theoretical specific impulse. In an ideal and perfect world, an RP1 powered engine could achieve about 370 seconds. An ideal hydrogen powered engine could get 532 seconds. And guess what? A methane powered engine is right in the middle with 459 seconds. Real world examples of this though are much lower, with RP1 engines seeing around 350 seconds like the Merlin 1D vacuum, around 380 seconds for a methane powered engine like the Raptor vacuum might be someday, and about 465 seconds for a hydrogen powered engine like the RL10B2. Next, let's talk about how hot each fuel burns. A fuel that burns cooler is easier on the engine and potentially makes for a longer lifespan.
RP1 can burn up to 3,670 Kelvin, hydrogen 3,070 Kelvin, and if you haven't guessed it by now, methane is again between the two at 3,550 Kelvin.
Speaking of thermal considerations, let's look at the boiling point for each of these fuels, or at what point does the liquid fuel boil off and turn into a gas. Since all of these fuels need to remain in their liquid state in order to stay dense,
the higher the temperature, the easier it is to store the fuel. A higher boiling point also means less or even no insulation on the tanks to keep the propellant from boiling off. And of course, less insulation means lighter tanks. Yay!
RP1 has a very high boiling point, even higher than water at 490 Kelvin. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is near absolute zero at a crazy cold 20 Kelvin. That's insanely cold, and it takes serious consideration to keep anything at that temperature. And like the Goldilocks it is, methane is between the two at 111 Kelvin, which, although that's still very cold and requires thermal considerations, it at least boils off at a temperature similar to LOX. So there's that.
And because it's so close to the temperature of LOX, the tanks can share a common dome, which makes the vehicle lighter. LOX and hydrogen's temperatures vary so wildly that LOX will boil off hydrogen and the hydrogen will freeze LOX solid. Now on to the exhaust. What are the byproducts of combustion with these engines? RP1 is really the only one of these three that really pollutes with any unburnt carbons being left in our atmosphere, alongside with some water vapor. But hydrogen only produces water vapor, and methane produces some carbon dioxide and water vapor as well. But an interesting note, now believe it or not, as far as greenhouse gases go, water in the upper atmosphere can be pretty bad. But I'll be doing a video in the future all about how much rockets pollute, talking about their air pollution, also their ocean pollution, and even space debris as a consideration. So stand by, because I think that video is going to be awesome. Now, one metric that we're just kind of going to gloss over really quick and talk about it generally is the cost. And these tend to vary considerably, and it's actually really hard to pin down the exact prices reliably. So for the considerations, RP1 is basically just a highly refined jet fuel, which jet fuel is a highly refined kerosene, which kerosene is a highly refined diesel. So it's safe to assume it's going to be more expensive than diesel. Hydrogen is also relatively expensive despite being abundant. Refining it, storing it, and transporting it can be hard. But methane, on the other hand, is basically the same thing as natural gas and can be relatively cheap. Now, when you're talking about buying literally tons of fuel, the fuel cost can add up quickly. So although the cost of fuel shouldn't factor in too much, it certainly is a consideration. But without hard data on this one, I don't even want to put it on our chart. So instead, let's talk about the more important aspect of the fuel. That's manufacturing it. And here's where we get into specifically why SpaceX sees methane as an important or even a necessary part of the company's future. SpaceX's ultimate goals are to develop a system capable of taking humans out to Mars and back over and over. The Martian atmosphere is CO2 rich. Now combine that with water mining from the surface and subsurface water on Mars through electrolysis and the Sabatier process, the Martian atmosphere can be made into methane fuel. So you don't have to take all the fuel you need to get home with you. You can make it right there using Mars's resources. This is called in situ resource utilization, or ISRU. Now you might be thinking, well, if there's water, can't you just make hydrogen on the surface of Mars for your fuel? Well, yes, but one of the biggest problems with hydrogen and long duration missions is the boiling point of hydrogen. Remember, it takes serious considerations to maintain hydrogen in a liquid state, and that's necessary to be useful as a fuel. So for SpaceX, methane makes a lot of sense. It's fairly dense, meaning the rocket sizes are pretty reasonable. It's fairly efficient, it burns clean, and makes for a highly reusable engine. It burns relatively cool, helping expand the lifespan of an engine, which again is good for usability. It's cheap and easy to produce, and can be easily produced on the surface of Mars. Okay, yeah, we finally made it this far. And now that we have a strong grasp of how different engine cycles operate and the fuels they use, we can finally line them all up side by side and compare their metrics to help us appreciate where each engine sits. So now we're going to line up each engine by their fuel type and their cycles. So let's start off with SpaceX's open cycle Merlin engine that powers their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets. NPO Energomesh's oxygen-rich closed-cycle RD-180 that we see power the Atlas V rocket, and Rocketdyne's open-cycle F1 that powers the Saturn V, which all three of these engines run on RP1. Then we have SpaceX's full-flow stage combustion cycle Raptor engine that will power the Starship and Super Heavy booster, and then we have Blue Origin's closed-cycle oxygen-rich methane-powered BE-4 engine that will power their New Glenn rocket and Yole's upcoming Vulcan rocket.
And then we have Aerojet Rocketdyne's closed cycle, fuel-rich RS-25 engine that powered the space shuttle and will power the upcoming SLS rocket, which runs on hydrogen. A few quick notes here. The Raptor and the BE-4, as of the making of this video, are still in development. So the numbers we have here are either their current state of progress, like the Raptor, which is constantly improving literally every day. And in the case of the BE-4, those are the target goals for the engine, which Blue Origin has yet to hit. So just keep that in mind, that these numbers are definitely subject to change. And now because of this, don't forget to check in with the article version attached in the description of this video. This video will likely date itself with some of these numbers, and I can't update this video, but I can update the website when more info comes through. So if you're looking to use any of these numbers as a source, please double check the website for any updates. Another fun note quick is look at the RD-180. Now, don't be confused, this is a single engine. It just has 2 combustion chambers. There's only a single turbo pump that splits its power into 2 combustion chambers. The Soviet Union was able to solve the crazy hot oxygen-rich closed cycle problem, but they were unable to solve combustion instability of large engines. So instead of one large combustion chamber, they made multiple small ones. So first up, let's take a look at their total thrust output at sea level. Since all these engines run at sea level, that's probably a fair place to compare them. Let's go from the least amount of thrust to the most for fun. The Merlin produces 0.84 meganewtons of thrust, the RS-25 produces 1.86 meganewtons, the Raptor currently is at 2 meganewtons, the BE-4 is hoping to hit 2.4 meganewtons, the RD-180 3.83 meganewtons, and the F1 is still the king out of these at 6.77 meganewtons. Now there was an engine called the RD-170 which actually produced more thrust than the F1, but since it barely flew, I figured it wasn't as relevant in this lineup. I thought it'd probably be a good idea to go with engines that have actually been used a lot. Thrust is great, but what's maybe just as important when designing a rocket is the thrust to weight ratio, or how heavy the engine is compared to how much thrust it produces. A higher thrust to weight ratio engine ultimately means less dead weight the rocket needs to lug around. Let's start from the lowest to highest here. The lowest is actually the Space Shuttle's RS-25 at 73:1. Then there's the RD-180, which is 78:1. Then we have the BE-4 at around 80:1, but keep in mind, we don't actually have a really good number on this, so there might be some wiggle room there. Then the F1 is 94:1. Then we have the Raptor, which is at about 107:1 for now. And lastly, the Merlin is actually the leader here with an astonishing 198:1 thrust to weight ratio. Yeah, that thing is a powerhouse. Okay, thrust is great and all, but who cares how powerful an engine is if it's terribly inefficient? So next up, let's check out their specific impulse, which again is measured in seconds. So starting with the least efficient engine, which is the F1 engine at 263 to 304 seconds. Then the Merlin engine at 282 to 311 seconds. Then we get the RD-180 at 311 seconds to 338 seconds. And somewhere in that same ballpark is the BE-4, which is around 310 to 340 seconds. Next up is the Raptor engine, which is 330 seconds to around 350 seconds. And lastly, the king here by far is the RS-25, which is 366 to 452 seconds. Wow. Now, one of the factors that affect both the thrust and specific impulse is chamber pressure. Now, generally, the higher the chamber pressure, the more thrust and potentially more efficient the engine can be. So, higher chamber pressures let an engine be smaller for a given thrust level, also improving their thrust to weight ratio. The baby here is actually the F1, which only had 70 bar in its chamber pressure. Now, I do need to pause here for a second and remind you that 70 bar is still 70 times the atmospheric pressure, or the same amount of pressure you'd experience at 700 meters underwater. Yikes. Okay, so even the lowest chamber pressure is still mind-bogglingly high. So next up is the Merlin engine at 97 bar, then the BE-4 will be around 135-ish bar, then the RS-25, which is 206 bar, then the RD-180, which has been considered the king of operational engines at about 257 bar. That is until the Raptor engine, which is now kind of online, which is considered the new king of chamber pressure at 270 bars currently, and they hope to get that thing up to 300 bar.
Again, 300 bars, like being 3 kilometers deep in the ocean. I can't even fathom. Okay, that's enough of the specs of these engines. Now let's look at their operational considerations, starting with their approximate cost. Now again, this can be kind of hard to nail down, so these are the best estimates that I could come up with. These numbers do factor in inflation to make them all in today's dollar though. Let's go with the most expensive and work our way down to the least expensive engine. The most expensive engine in the lineup is the RS-25, which has a sticker price of over $50 million per engine. Yikes. Then we have the F1, which was about $30 million per engine. Then the RD-180, which is $25 million per engine. Then the BE-4, which is around $8 million per engine. And for the Raptor, Elon has mentioned he thinks he can produce the Raptor for cheaper than or close to the Merlin engine if they can remove a lot of the complexity that the current engine has. So for now, we're gonna say $2 million as a pretty decent ballpark. Then we have the Merlin engine, which is less than $1 million, I think. Okay, well, cost is one thing, but another strong consideration for the cost of the engine is whether or not it's reusable. And here, only the RD-180 and the F1 were not reusable, or at least never reused, which is different than all these other engines, which will all be reused multiple times. The RS-25 was reused over and over, with the record being 19 flights out of a single engine. Well, then again, that's after a few months of refurbishment. The Merlin is hoping to see up to 10 flights without major refurbishment. We know a design goal for the BE-4 is to be reused up to 25 times, and I think the Raptor engine hopes to see up to 50 flights. But again, aspirations are one thing, we'll see how history treats these claims. But one quick fun little story here is don't forget the Merlin engine, which SpaceX currently uses on the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets, are already fired a bunch of times before they even make it to the pad. Each engine that is built goes from Hawthorne, California to their test stand in McGregor, Texas, where it does a full duration burn. Then those engines go back to California, where they're integrated onto the Octaweb, which is at the base of the vehicle. Then they take the entire stage and they take it back out to McGregor for a full duration static fire. So it goes through the whole mission basically again. Then they ship it to the launch pad where it does a short static fire, and then it flies the mission. So it's already done like 3 missions in duration of firing by the time it flies for the first time. So I'm not entirely sure what the most times a single engine has done a full duration burn. We know that some of the cores were sat out on the pad and fired for a really long time, multiple times over and over. So I think they've probably done almost 10 flight full duration burns out of a single engine. But you know, I have no doubt they can probably do that if they say. I mean, they have more experience in this than anybody already, reusing engines without really refurbishing them. So I'm gonna definitely take their word for it. On the topic of price, there's actually some things here that start to get really interesting when we start looking at these numbers. The first is an interesting metric that Elon talked about once in a tweet in February of 2019, saying they hope to make the Raptor get better at their thrust to dollar ratio. Now this is a really interesting concept when you think about it. Who cares how much an engine costs if one big engine is cheaper than 2 smaller ones for the same thrust or vice versa? So let's actually take a look at the dollar to kilonewton ratio of these engines. Starting with the most expensive dollar to kilonewton engine, which is the RS-25 at a crazy $26,881 to kilonewtons of thrust. Then the RD-180, which is $6,527 to 1 kilonewton, followed by the F1 at $4,431 per kilonewton, and then we get to the BE-4, which is $3,333 to 1 kilonewton, the Merlin engine at $1,170 per kilonewton, and the Raptor at around $1,000 per kilonewton. But now we can go even another step further since we know their dollar to kilonewton ratio, but we also know their reusability potential. Now we can predict their potential cost per kilonewton per flight, which changes based on how reusable these engines actually are. So for starters, since the RD-180 and the F1 aren't reusable, their price stays the same. But for the rest of the engines, if we take into account how many flights they have/will have, now we start to see the RS-25 reusability pay off and kind of close the gap, bringing its potential cost down to just $1,414 per kilonewton per flight. But here's where things get crazy. Blue Origin's BE-4 has potential to truly be game-changing at around $133 per kilonewton over 25 flights, which could make it about as cheap to operate as the Merlin at $117 per kilonewton per flight. But if the Raptor engine truly lives up to its hype, it could bring this number all the way down to $20 per kilonewton per flight. Now that is absolutely game-changing. Sure, money and reusability is a 21st century focus for spaceflight, but whatever happened to good old proven reliability? For this, let's first look at how many operational flights each engine has had. Now, at the moment of shooting this video, the Raptor and BE-4 haven't seen any operational flights, although the Raptor is starting to leave the test stand and is being used on test vehicles like the Starhopper. But for now, neither engine has a real flight record. So let's look at the other engines. First, we have the F1 engine, which was used on 17 flights. Next up is the Merlin engine, which is at 71 flights and catching up quickly to the RD-180, which is at 79 flights. But the king out of these was the RS-25, which saw 135 flights. Now, lastly, how about reliability in service? Between the number of flights and this number, we can get a pretty good sense of how truly reliable an engine is. This number is really hard to just pin down since some of the engines may have shut down early, but the mission was still a success on a few of these, so take a few of these with a grain of salt. Again, the BE-4 and Raptor engine haven't flown yet, so those numbers are unavailable. Then we have the Space Shuttle main engine, which is over 99.5% reliable, but that gets hard to define when an engine doesn't fully shut down. And then we have the Merlin at 99.9% reliable. It sure helps when you have 10 engines on each flight of the vehicle, and with only one engine ever failing early on in its career, and despite that, that mission was still a success, so the Merlin is a very reliable engine.
Now to end this, technically the RD-180 and the F1 are 100% reliable, but with the F1 never having shut down at all in any flight, it gets the bold here, and depending on how you define success and reliability, technically, the RD-180 is only kind of 100% reliable because it got really lucky once.
One time it shut down 6 seconds early on an Atlas V mission in 2016. This was due to a faulty valve, but the mission went on to be a success because of some pure luck, with the Centaur upper stage having enough spare Delta V to carry out the mission. Had that valve failed even a second earlier, that mission would have failed.
Man, seeing all these numbers and considerations, it makes you realize just how many variables go into designing a rocket. I mean, change any one little thing and it can have this massive ripple effect on the entire design and the implementation of the vehicle as a whole. So let's go back over all of this now that we know all the cycles, the fuels, the aspirations of SpaceX, to see if we can figure out why the Raptor engine exists and figure out if it's worth all the effort. Let's look at SpaceX's ultimate plan. Make a rapidly and fully reusable vehicle capable of sending humans to the moon and Mars as inexpensively and routinely as possible. It's not exactly your everyday goal for a rocket, huh? In order to be rapidly and fully reusable, the engine needs to run clean and require low maintenance with simple turbopump seals and low pre-burner temperatures. A methane-fueled, full-flow staged combustion cycle engine sounds like a good fit. For reliability, redundancy, and scale of manufacturing considerations, it makes sense to employ a lot of engines. In order to scale an engine down but maintain a high output, chamber pressure needs to be high. Sounds like a methane-fueled, full-flow staged combustion cycle engine is a good fit. For interplanetary trips, methane makes the most sense because its boiling point makes it usable on long-duration trips to Mars, which, guess what? You can produce methane on Mars, so for interplanetary trips, a methane-fueled, full-flow staged combustion cycle engine sounds like a good fit. Methane is fairly dense, meaning the tank size remains reasonable, which again is good for interplanetary trips, not needing to lug around a lot of dead weight, making a methane-fueled, full-flow staged combustion cycle a pretty good fit. Okay, so let's bring this all back around now. Is the Raptor engine really the king of rocket engines? Well, rocket science, like all things, is a complex series of compromises. Is it the most efficient engine? No. Is it the most powerful engine? No. Is it the cheapest engine? Probably not. Is it the most reusable engine? Maybe. But does it do everything really well? Yeah. It is truly a Goldilocks engine, doing everything it needs to do very, very well. It is the perfect fit for your interplanetary spaceship. And despite its complexity, SpaceX is developing this engine at a rapid pace. I mean, knowing how much tweaking SpaceX did to their Merlin engine over a decade, we're just at the infancy of the Raptor engine. It's only gonna get better from here on out, which is crazy. So all in all, the Raptor engine is the king of this application. It's a fantastic engine to fulfill SpaceX's goals for their Starship vehicle. Would it be the king of other applications? Maybe, maybe not. And I'll leave that decision for the rocket scientists and engineers who get to make all those crazy decisions every single day. So what do you think? Is it worth all this hassle to develop such a crazy and complex engine? Is this just the beginning for the Raptor engine? And most importantly, is the Raptor engine really the king of rocket engines? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Okay, I know I say this every video, but I honestly could not have done this video without the help of my Patreon supporters. They not only kept me sane for the past 5 months as I worked on this video, but they also went over all the data with me. They gave me great feedback and suggestions in the edits of this video. If you want to help support what I do, or provide feedback in videos, or help script and research, or if you just want to hang out and talk space, consider joining our exclusive Discord channel and our exclusive subreddit by becoming a Patreon member by going to patreon.com/everydayastronaut. Thank you guys. Seriously, I couldn't have made this video without you. And while you're online, be sure and check out my web store. Seriously, I have really cool things like these F1 t-shirts, tons of other shirts. There's lots of new merchandise popping up in there all the time, so check back often. We have things like grid fit Nautic coasters and hats and shirts and mugs and prints. Just literally tons of cool rocket stuff. So if that's your type of thing, be sure and check out my web store, everydayastronaut.com/shop, and then click on the music tab if you want to check out any of the songs used in this video. That's all music that I've written over the years. You can listen to it on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify, and Google Music, all that stuff. And also there's a playlist right here on YouTube for music video versions of that too as well, which is a fun way to watch and listen. So show it to a friend. Thanks everybody, that's gonna do it for me. I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, bringing space down to Earth for everyday people.
Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Blue Origin, perhaps the sleeping giant of the aerospace industry, will be going from a tiny little suborbital rocket to one of the biggest rockets ever made. Now, you guys have been asking me to do a video all about Blue Origin and their massively ambitious New Glenn rocket. But I've withheld. Why? Well, to date, we really didn't have that much information. Just some pretty animations, a few videos of them firing their BE-4 engine, and a few basic specs of the vehicle. Blue Origin has been awfully quiet about this monster rocket. Until now. Finally, Blue Origin blessed us, or really their future customers, with a payload users guide. That sounds like the lamest announcement ever. But in all reality, it's super exciting as we finally get those nitty-gritty details that I've been waiting for. So today, we actually get to do a quick rundown on Blue Origin. We're going to talk about their upcoming New Glenn rocket, and then we're going to compare it to some other heavy lift launchers that it's going to be competing against. Finally, I've been waiting a long time for this one. Let's get started.
3, 2, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Okay, since I haven't really done any videos on Blue Origin yet, let's do a super quick rundown on who they are. Blue Origin was founded in the year 2000 by the richest human alive, Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon. That's right, they were actually founded 2 years before SpaceX. So wait, they've been around for almost 2 decades and have no shortage of money. What the heck have they been up to? That's actually a fair question. Blue Origin is extremely tight-lipped, and we often don't hear about what they're working on until one day they're like, oh hey, we did this. And with their company motto being Gradium Ferociter, Latin for step-by-step ferociously, they're conservative on their timelines, slow to show off their details, but just as ambitious as the rest of them. So with that in mind, Blue Origin started chasing the suborbital tourism game first, and they still are to this day. In 2005, Jeff Bezos discussed plans for a vertical takeoff and landing suborbital spaceship called New Shepard. Their first test began all the way back in 2006 with a launch of their subscale demonstrator called Goddard. Named after the pioneer of the liquid-fueled rocket engine, Robert Goddard, this little guy was the company's testbed to learn how to propulsively land, a key technology they'd be utilizing in their upcoming New Shepard program. Think of this like SpaceX's Grasshopper program, which served a similar purpose for SpaceX. The only publicly released flight reached 86 meters and lasted 25 seconds. The vehicle flew at least 3 times in total, with the last known flight in 2007. In 2011, Blue Origin began testing a version of their booster for the New Shepard, climbing to over 13 kilometers in altitude and reaching Mach 1.2 in the process. In 2012, the company did a pad abort test of their crew capsule. By 2015, they began testing their first full New Shepard system, which is an 18-meter tall booster and capsule designed to kiss the edge of space with up to 6 passengers on board for a 20-minute flight. It's a single-stage liquid-fueled booster powered by their BE-3 engine, running on liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Their plan was to separate the booster and the passenger capsule after main engine cutoff and have the capsule safely land via parachutes, nice, simple, and proven, while the booster was going to attempt a rocketry first, land propulsively after touching the edge of space. Their first flight on April 29, 2015 was a partial success, with the capsule and booster just about kissing the Kármán line, or the boundary of space, before returning to Earth. Now, the important thing is the capsule was safely recovered via parachutes. However, their first attempt at landing a booster was not successful, citing a failure of hydraulic pressure in the control system, leading to a complete loss of the vehicle. It only took 7 months for Blue Origin to return to their Texas launch site with a New Shepard rocket, ready to continue testing their suborbital workhorse. Their launch on November 23, 2015 was picture perfect. After successfully reaching 100.5 kilometers in altitude, the booster and capsule came rushing back down to Earth. The capsule popped its parachutes and was recovered exactly as planned. However, the booster continued falling back to Earth, just falling, gaining velocity with each passing moment, the ground coming closer and closer and closer, till suddenly its engine ignited exactly as planned and it performed the world's first propulsive landing after reaching the edge of space. Sorry for the drama, I just wanted to spice it up a little bit. So yeah, they absolutely nailed their second flight. And not only that, they actually reused that exact same booster again, taking it up to space and landing it precisely. And then they did that same thing again 3 more times for a total of 5 times, with the last flight even doing something more impressive. They performed an in-flight launch abort, which is where they literally lit a solid rocket booster on top of the main booster, and it still survived. Now that is absolutely mind-blowing. They've since retired that second booster, which is now sitting at their factory, and they're on to their third New Shepard. It's flown 3 times to date, with the last one also being an abort test, but at apogee. This validated their abort system throughout every portion of flight, providing extra confidence that their passengers are safe no matter the circumstances. So the New Shepard is crazy impressive, setting many space flight first and getting really close to finally launching people. And I know it's just a suborbital rocket, and although the total energy and velocities involved in these little hops is nothing compared to orbital flight, it's still an absolutely incredible rocket. Okay, so now I hear you. You're sitting there going, wait, I thought the video title was Will Blue Origin be the king of heavy lift rockets? How is this anywhere comparable to, say, Falcon Heavy? Well, seeing as New Shepard isn't even that much taller than one of Falcon Heavy's landing legs, yeah, you're right. But now let's check out Blue Origin's next rocket. Whoa, wait, they're going from this to this? From a Cessna to a 747? From a canoe to a cruise ship? From an ant to an elephant? This can't be right, can it? Well, it is, and it's called New Glenn. Are you seeing a pattern yet? From Goddard, a guy who tested rockets, to New Shepard, as in Alan Shepard, the first American to fly in space on a suborbital flight, and now New Glenn, as in John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth. But come on, anyone can draw pictures of a giant rocket and say it's going to be super, super big and have really powerful lasers and stuff. So how seriously can we actually take this? Does this answer your question? Whoa. Design work began in 2012 to develop a partially reusable heavy lift rocket, and in 2015, Blue Origin made their plans public. But they dropped another fun hint, claiming this rocket would be the smallest of their orbital rockets. Not only that, its maiden voyage is scheduled for 2021, and Blue Origin is historically fairly accurate with their dates, so this might actually hold. New Glenn will initially launch from LC-36 at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. This pad has hosted over 140 launches, formerly launching the Atlas II and Atlas III. Their factory at Kennedy Space Center's Exploration Park is located very close to their launch pad, only about 15 kilometers away. Blue Origin is also working on securing a launch pad at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. I'll be curious if they'll have to build another factory, kinda doubt it, or if they're just going to ship it through the Panama Canal like many other rockets. New Glenn's going to be powered by 7 of the company's BE-4 engines. The BE-4 is racing to become the first operational orbital-class rocket engine to run on methane. The other is SpaceX's Raptor engine. They're both crazy impressive engines, but they take on the task in pretty different ways. The Raptor engine is a full-flow, closed-cycle methane engine that's approximately the same size as SpaceX's Merlin engines, while the BE-4 is a closed-cycle engine that's closer in size to the RS-25 Space Shuttle main engine, which means it's very, very big. The BE-4 is very far along in its development. They've successfully hot-fired full-scale versions of the engine many times, including some tests lasting over 200 seconds. The performance of the engine has been so attractive, it was chosen by ULA to be the engine they will use on their upcoming Vulcan rocket. The upper stage of the New Glenn will feature 2 vacuum-optimized versions of their BE-3 engine, that same engine that powers their New Shepard launcher, only these will be called BE-3Us. Combined, they produce just over a meganewton thrust. We can kind of speculate similar efficiency to the RL-10 vacuum engine, perhaps the United States' most prolific upper stage engine. Like the RL-10, the BE-3U will be an expander cycle engine, but interestingly, it'll be an open expander bleed cycle and not a closed cycle expander. The only other currently operating open bleed expander cycle, at least that I know of, is being used by Japan on the LE-5 series. Blue Origin is also planning on using autogenous pressurization on both stages. This means they won't use an inert gas like helium or nitrogen to maintain pressure in the fuel and oxidizer tanks, which can be cool because it can decrease complexity. SpaceX is also planning on using the same system on their upcoming Starship and Super Heavy, previously known as BFR. The rocket's fuselage is made out of aluminum, like most other rockets. There were rumors of Blue Origin making a carbon composite upper stage, but at least for the initial version, it's going to be aluminum. There will be a common bulkhead on the upper stage, a technique first seen on the Saturn V. Okay, all this is pretty impressive, but we haven't got to the coolest part of New Glenn. Blue Origin will be recovering and reusing the first stage. Blue Origin is actually quoting up to 25 reuses out of these massive boosters. And seeing how well they've done with New Shepard, I really hope that's a metric they can hit. That's super impressive and will certainly help bring the cost down. They'll be doing a similar technique to what SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavies do most of the time, by propulsively landing downrange on a large ship in the ocean. Now, before you accuse them of ripping off SpaceX, Two notes. First off, if they did, would it matter? Why wouldn't you replicate an awesome system that works so well? But second off, just to throw a little salt at some haters, Blue Origin actually filed a patent for reusable rocket booster landing on a sea-going platform in 2010. Crazy. After a bit of a dispute between SpaceX and Blue Origin, the US Patent Trial and Appeal Board canceled Blue Origin's patent claim, meaning the case was lost and SpaceX was given the go-ahead to continue pursuing landing on a ship. But like I said, I don't really care who did it first or whose idea it was first. It's clearly a great idea, and it's what helps allow a significant payload to be lofted into orbit while having enough propellant margin to propulsively land. Unlike SpaceX's autonomous spaceport drone ship, Blue Origin's ship is actually a full-blown Stena freighter container ship called the LPV, or Landing Platform Vehicle. Another notable difference is the LPV will actually be moving while the rocket lands on it. This helps keep the landing platform stable, allowing recovery during rough seas. And I know, you're probably sitting there going, that sounds impossible. How could they land on a moving ship? Isn't that super, super hard? Well, I actually don't think it's gonna be that much different. The rocket can kind of know the trajectory, and I'm assuming they've figured this all out and know how to work it out. So I think they'll be fine, but I'm excited to see them do it. The actual physical landing area is almost the same size as SpaceX's, at around 4,500 square meters. Only theirs is a little skinnier and longer, and SpaceX is a little closer to a square. And although the propulsive landing might actually look similar to the Falcon 9, the hardware Blue Origin uses before that couldn't be more different. Instead of grid fins at the top end of the booster, the New Glenn will use some small fins, similar to the New Shepard. And although I don't think these fins are going to retract into the booster, they are used for the same purpose, which is to steer through the atmosphere. The New Glenn also has what could be described as some small wings, or strakes, on the lower portion of the booster. These increase the surface area, helping allow the fuselage to generate more lift, which can give the booster a little more cross-range capability, and also gives the atmosphere more time to bleed off more energy. Just like if you were skydiving, your terminal velocity would be a lot slower if you're belly first compared to feet first. We can also see SpaceX perform a little bit of this with their Falcon 9s, but with some additional surface area, New Glenn might almost be able to fly and slow down a substantial amount. Another fun thing to note is how far downrange these boosters will likely land. One of the fun little details to come out of this New Glenn payload user's guide is how long the first stage will actually burn for. The first stage will burn a whopping 199 seconds, or 3 minutes and 19 seconds. Compare that to SpaceX, whose longest burn times are often not much over 2 minutes and 40 seconds. An additional 30 seconds or more of a vehicle traveling at well over 2,000 meters per second, yeah, that's gonna put their recoveries pretty far downrange. Now, again, we don't know the exact flight profile or MECO velocity, but judging by the fact that SpaceX's furthest drone ship landing is around 680 kilometers downrange, New Glenn will probably land significantly further. Blue Origin's website does state the New Glenn will land nearly 1,000 kilometers downrange, but I might venture to guess it'll go beyond that even. What do you think? Place your bets now by voting here. Okay, so now that we're finally done giving you a rundown and we're getting pretty heavily into the comparison mode, it's time we actually stack up how the New Glenn will perform against the other launchers in this class that are going to be flying around the same time. Some notes here before we get started. If we include all the heavy lift launches from around the world, our chart and our screen is going to get pretty cluttery. So we're just going to compare the 5 United States heavy lift launchers that will hopefully be near operating when New Glenn goes online. All 5 of these rockets either are already flying payloads for the US Air Force, or they've won contracts by the Air Force. That's another reason why I put these together. We're also going to be leaving out any super heavy lift launchers like the Starship/Super Heavy, previously known as BFR, and the SLS, since those rockets are in a completely different class on their own. I love doing these, and this one is very interesting. So first up is SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, the only other reusable launcher in this class. Now, next up is another 3-core heavy lifter, ULA's mighty Delta IV Heavy. Then we have ULA's other launcher, the Vulcan. Now, do note, this is not the Vulcan Heavy, which won't be online for a while longer. But even with just the standard Vulcan with 6 solid, it's right within the same specs as all these other rockets. Then we have Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems' upcoming Omega rocket. But a quick note, they too will probably be making a heavy version of the Omega. but who knows when that's gonna come out. And there's really not that much information out about this rocket, so I had to fudge a few of these numbers, but I think they're pretty close, but take them all with a little grain of salt. And of course we have Blue Origin's New Glenn, which if you need a recap on this rocket, just rewind 5 minutes. So let's start with the most obvious thing, their heights. That New Glenn is massive. Standing at 95 meters tall, it's much taller than Falcon Heavy at 70, Delta IV Heavy at 71, Vulcan at 66, and the Omega at 60 meters tall. New Glenn is also the widest, by quite a large amount too, at 7 meters wide. Now compare that to 3.6 meters, well, times 3 of the Falcon Heavy, 5 meters, again, times 3 of the Delta IV Heavy, 5.4 meters of the Vulcan, and 5 meters of the Omega. Next, we need to check out their fairing sizes. Now here's where New Glenn is in the class of its own. Its internal volume is massive, a whopping 458 cubic meters, compared to the Falcon Heavy, which shares the same relatively small fairing as the Falcon 9 at 145 cubic meters. Then there's the Delta IV, which can have up to 233 cubic meters. Now I can't find the exact numbers on Vulcan or Omega, but I believe they're probably going to be around that same 230 cubic meter-ish region. This massive fairing allows the New Glenn to do dual payloads with up to 10,000 kilograms in either the upper or the lower payload berths. This is something that ESA's Ariane 5 has done very well with. And now it looks like New Glenn is taking a note from its playbook. Now let's talk engines. There couldn't be a wider variety of engines on these rockets. The New Glenn, of course, has those 7 BE4 engines running Methalox on the first stage and 2 BE3Us on the upper stage running Hydrolox. The Falcon Heavy has 27 Merlin 1Ds running Paralox on the first stage and a single vacuum-optimized Merlin 1D on the upper stage running Paralox also. The Delta IV Heavy has 3 RS-68As running Hydrolox and an upper stage with an RL-10B also running Hydrolox. Then we have the Vulcan, which actually has the same main engines as the New Glenn, the BE4, but again it only has 2. However, it can have up to 6 powerful strap-on solid rocket boosters. Its upper stage has 2 RL-10Cs running Hydrolox. Then there's the Omega rocket, which is just solids on solids and a dash of Hydrolox on top. It's a 3-stage rocket with a Castor 600 main booster, which is similar to the Space Shuttle solid rocket boosters, but only has 2 segments instead of 4. Then it has a Castor 300 solid stage, and then its upper stage is similar to the Vulcan, as it too is RL-10C powered, but down to just 1, which also runs Hydrolox. And it can have up to 6 Gen 63 Exile strap-on solid rocket boosters as well. Okay, now let's get on to the fun stuff, thrust. The New Glenn delivers a more middle-of-the-road 16,800 kilonewtons of thrust, much less than the Falcon Heavy, which has 22,815 kilonewtons. But that's much more than the Delta IV Heavy at 9,420 kilonewtons. The Vulcan, almost ironically, comes in at virtually the exact same amount of thrust as New Glenn, despite having literally the exact same engines, well, but 2 instead of 7, but what it lacks in BE4s, it makes up for in SRBs, winding up with almost the exact same total thrust at 16,812. The Omega rocket has a combined 21,798 kilonewtons of thrust with 7 SRBs firing. That sounds crazy. I can't wait to hear one of those fly. Okay, so thrust is great and all, but what can these things actually deliver to orbit? And now before we dive too far into this, I do want to point out I'm going to be quoting the 3 booster recoveries for Falcon Heavy, 1 at sea, 2 at land, as I think that's how we're going to see it fly most of the time. And we're also going to be quoting the first stage recovery of New Glenn, as I don't think they ever intend to expend one. So keep that in mind when we're looking at these numbers. So first, how much can these rockets get to low Earth orbit? New Glenn can loft a massive 45 tons to LEO, Falcon Heavy 30. The Delta IV Heavy can take 28 tons, the Vulcan 27.5 tons, and the Omega I can't find an exact number on, but it's probably around 30 tons. And lastly, let's compare how much they can shoot off to a geostationary transfer orbit. New Glenn can loft 13.6 tons, Falcon Heavy 8 tons, Delta IV Heavy 14 tons, Vulcan 13 tons, and Omega 10.1 tons. A few reasons we see such massive differences in capabilities between these vehicles, again, is due to their recoverability, the efficiency of their engines, and in some cases, their physical size. And of course, the other big factor here is price. And at this point, we just don't have good enough information on all these launchers, or at least not accurate enough to wisely factor them in here. So that being said, I do think Falcon Heavy will be the one to beat, at least as far as price goes. I'll be very curious if New Glenn or any of the others will be able to beat it. So all in all, New Glenn is shaping up to be a super impressive rocket. By the numbers, it'll be the largest and most capable rocket flying when it goes online. Well, that is, of course, unless SLS makes it online, which I highly doubt it will do by 2021, or if SpaceX's Super Heavy starts flying by then, which I will see, but the race is on. I have a feeling the New Glenn is going to be impressively cost competitive as well. Seeing how they're planning to reuse the booster 25 times, how they can do massive dual payloads, and with streamlined operations like having their factory right next to the launch pad, this might shake up the industry. I, for one, am extremely excited to see this thing fly. And as you may or may not know by now, I'm not really a big fan of tribalism, or just picking a favorite rocket or a favorite company. So, of course, I'm going to be cheering on Blue Origin and their New Glenn rocket all the way to orbit. 2021 can't come soon enough. So I'm sure the comment section is full of Jeff Who and other whatevers about Blue Origin and New Glenn. I don't really care what you guys think. I'm super excited for this, and I'm just a big fan of being positive and cheering on everyone in the aerospace industry. So I encourage our community here to do the same thing. So while you're down there in the comment section, let me know if you have any other questions about Blue Origin, about rockets, spaceflight, or even just give me feedback on if you think these videos are improving in quality or what things you think I'm missing or could improve on. As always, I owe a super huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping me do all of this stuff. There's a lot of work that goes into scripting and research, shooting and editing, and I couldn't do it without you guys. There's even patrons that are sitting in my exclusive Discord channel or sitting in our exclusive subreddit that help me script and research. If you want to help contribute or even get access to exclusive live streams, please visit patreon.com/everydayastronaut. And while you're online, be sure and check out my brand new web store for things like these Gridfin Nauticoasters. Now, notice these are not coasters because they have holes in them, and that means the liquid can drip through to your surface. But I do promise they're going to keep your drink elevated exactly this high off of whatever surface they're on, making them Gridfin Nauticoaster drink elevators. And there's also lots of other fun stuff like shirts, hats, mugs, prints of rocket launches, and other original photographs, as well as stickers and patches. There's tons of new stuff on my brand new web store. You need to check it out. everydayastronaut.com/shop. And finally, I did it. I got my music online for you guys. You've been asking me forever to get it up on iTunes and Spotify and yada, yada, yada. I finally have Maximum Aerodynamic Pressure, my first 7-song EP, available hopefully everywhere you listen to music. So search for it, listen to it while you're doing some science, maybe you're studying, maybe you're...
Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Rockets are huge, complicated, and expensive. As a matter of fact, the rocket that took humans to the moon, the Saturn V, was 111 meters or 363 feet tall and had more separation events than dating teenagers.
Do not let them reach the purification pump.
I actually didn't mean for that one to happen. So why do rockets always split themselves up into multiple parts? Isn't that complicated and risky? Why throw so much of it away? I mean, there's got to be a better way. Well, how about if rockets were only one stage? How awesome would that be? Well, this idea isn't new. It's called single stage to orbit, or SSTO, and it's often considered the holy grail of rocketry. Well, today I'm gonna smash that holy grail and explain why I think SSTOs suck. In order to drill this point in, we'll teach you all about the tyranny of the rocket equation and help you understand why every orbital rocket, well, ever, is multi-stage. Then we'll take a stroll down SSTO history and look at some crazy designs that in some cases almost worked. And not to be a huge downer, we'll also take a look at some SSTO designs that might actually work, including the Skylon spaceplane that uses that awesome Sabre hybrid engine. Okay, Everyday Astronaut versus SSTOs. Oh man, the comment section's gonna love this one. But hear me out. Let's get started. So if you've ever played Kerbal Space Program, you know that awesome computer game where you design, build, and fly rockets, these little green alien frog guys, and you get them off their home planet of Kerbin.
Yeah, that one. Then you know SSTOs are all the rage. As a matter of fact, building an SSTO is kind of bragging rights, something to post on Reddit. But what if I told you I can't really think of one good reason to build an SSTO in real life? Well, there's a few potential benefits, but do they outweigh all the negatives? Okay. So before I sound like some kind of old grump here, get off my lawn, you darn kids, with your SSTOs. Let's talk about why SSTOs are considered desirable by some, and why people dream about a time when launch vehicles are only one stage. Imagine a world where a launch vehicle takes off, goes to space, comes back, refuels, and does that multiple times a day. No problem. Sounds like a real-life Millennium Falcon. When most people use the term SSTO, it's inferred that the vehicle would be reusable. It would go up into space, come back down, all in one piece, throwing away only fuel to get it there and back. And again, when talking about reusable SSTOs, most people in concepts utilize a spaceplane design, a vehicle which takes off and lands like a plane. Sounds great, right? One vehicle to do it all. Nice and simple. Take off from any runway, just like a jetliner at an airport, and then instead of leveling out at a boring old 10 kilometers or 35,000 feet or so, keep accelerating and increase your altitude until you're in orbit. Then when your mission's done, you just come back down from space and land on any old runway. Again, like any other jetliner. SSTOs don't sound that bad, do they? Uh-oh, have I lost my mind? Well, before we keep dreaming about our potential sci-fi future, let's take a quick look at the history of rockets to see why so far SSTOs haven't been attainable. The first liquid fuel rockets ever made were just one stage. Basically, a rocket engine, some propellant inside a fuselage, and in most cases, some kind of warhead on top. Rockets were mostly used as an advanced weapon delivery system at first, but lucky for us, they also so happen to be able to be used for spaceflight. The V-2 rockets built by Germany were the first rockets to ever reach the edge of space. In June 1944, a V-2 rocket on a test flight reached beyond the Kármán line, the most commonly agreed upon boundary of space, at 100 kilometers or 62 miles in altitude. Sure, a single stage rocket can get up to space, but what about stay in space? Well, in order to stay in space, an object needs to reach orbital velocity. To orbit the Earth, a vehicle needs to be traveling at about 28,000 kilometers an hour or 17,500 miles per hour to stay in space. Okay, so now we have a new goal for humanity. Get something into orbit. Well, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union managed to place Sputnik 1 into orbit. The shiny metal ball with scary-looking spiky antennas weighed only 83.6 kilograms or 184 pounds. Hey, that's pretty much my weight. The vehicle that carried Sputnik to low Earth orbit was a two-stage launch vehicle most commonly known as the R-7. This rocket was revolutionary and allowed the vehicle to drop unnecessary weight on ascent by ejecting spent fuel tanks and rocket engines that were no longer necessary. This is called staging. It was revolutionary and pivotal in putting something of any significance into orbit. Staging is the #1 cure for the tyranny of the rocket equation. The tyranny of the rocket equation is basically the diminishing returns on adding fuel. If you were to double the amount of fuel in your rocket, you wouldn't double the delta V or change your velocity. Due to now having to push around all the extra weight of the extra fuel and the fuel tank that holds it, the rocket is able to burn longer, sure, but it doesn't receive anywhere near double the change in velocity. And it only gets worse the further you go until the rocket actually gets too heavy for the engine, and the next thing you know, you're adding engines to lift the extra fuel, and so on and so on and so on. So this is where staging comes in. Once a rocket empties a fuel tank, why not throw it away? Even better, if the rocket is throttling down an engine to stay accelerating at a safe speed, why not throw away the heavy, unnecessary engines? This is what the R-7 rocket did. It was basically a good-sized rocket with 4 extra rockets attached to it. Once those side rockets were spent, they were detached in this really cool formation known as the Korolev Cross, named after Sergei Korolev, who you can think of as like the Werner von Braun of the Soviet space program. By the way, you can still see the Korolev Cross on any of today's Soyuz launches. Separation events are often a breath-holding moment in flight. There are 2 main types of staging events. First, there's parallel staging, where multiple stages are fired and active at once. like Soyuz or the Space Shuttle or Falcon Heavy. Everyone holds their breath during staging because if a booster doesn't separate, the mission will fail. It was definitely a big moment when the side boosters of the Falcon Heavy separated safely. Or there's an even more complex and nail-biting type of staging called tandem staging. This is what most multi-stage rockets do. The first stage will fire first, then that engine cuts off, the first stage and the second stage separate, and the second stage fires and keeps going to orbit as a brand new, fresh rocket. Not only is the second stage basically a new, fully fueled little baby rocket, but their engines are also optimized for the vacuum of space by having a much larger exhaust nozzle. But that's another huge advantage of staging, having different engines optimized for different environments. The first rocket ever to do any kind of tandem staging was called the RTB-G4 Bumper. It was literally a V2 rocket with a small sounding rocket on top of it. It was launched between 1948 and 1950 and launched 8 times, creating a lot of valuable data on multi-staging. But this stage separation event was really hard to accomplish and almost considered impossible for a long time. That's why many early rockets utilized parallel staging. As a matter of fact, separation events, or more specifically a botched separation event, almost led to SpaceX being another forgotten aerospace company who went bankrupt after only 3 flight attempts. Flight 3 of their Falcon 1 rocket had a stage separation event go wrong when the first stage had a little extra residual thrust after stage separation, causing it to bump into the upper stage, leading to a failed mission. So if it was so coveted and necessary to make multi-stage launchers, why are SSTOs so sought after? Well, there's something to say about making a less complicated launch vehicle. So maybe SSTOs are good for something. I guess in order to see if SSTOs make sense, let's pop on over to my computer where I'll fire up Kerbal Space Program to help figure out if stages are a friend or foe. Welcome to Kerbal Space Program with Realism Overhaul. Now, Realism Overhaul is about 1 million different modifications to make Kerbal Space Program have a real solar system. It makes it a lot harder and a lot more realistic. Okay, so our goal today, we're trying to take a 1 metric ton satellite up to an orbit at 250 kilometers in altitude. So I built us a nice, simple 2-stage rocket with an RL-10 vacuum engine, which is an excellent vacuum engine. And then it has a SpaceX Merlin 1D engine on its first stage. So altogether, this thing's about 34.9 meters tall and has about 9,237 meters per second, according to Kerbal Engineer Redux. Okay, now let's get ready to take this thing off. And we'll do engine ignition. And 3, 2, 1, hip hip! Yeah, look at it go. Alright, we're gonna speed this thing up here a little bit and watch it get up into orbit. Alright, now notice I've got the map pulled up here too, so you get an idea of, if this were to run out of fuel right now, it would still be coasting up to its apoapsis, its highest point, or apogee. So you can see there, we got the map pulled up, and it gives us a pretty good idea of where this thing's going. Now, just like if you were to throw a ball, it kind of goes up in arcs. If you were to throw it further, it would arc further and further away. Well, we're just accelerating continually, making that arc extend out even further and further and further away. That's how rockets work. Okay, now we're running out of fuel in our first stage, so we're going to go ahead and do stage separation. And now we're going to light up that upper stage. And there it goes. That's the RL-10 upper stage. And this is optimized for working in the vacuum of space. So it means it has a really high specific impulse. And specific impulse is kind of like your miles per gallon for a rocket engine. And this thing's just going to keep on accelerating now. It's going to keep on going and get itself into orbit. So it's got a long ways to go now. So this upper stage has to do a lot of work still. Look, it's still accelerating. And again, if it were to cut off right now and run out of gas right now, even though it was a fresh rocket, only about halfway done, it wouldn't even make it to the coast of Africa. So you can see on the map there, we're not making it that far yet. Okay, so we're just gonna keep speeding up and speeding up and speeding up until we get up to around 7,500 meters per second, which is about 28,000 kilometers an hour or 17,500 miles per hour. And we're just going to do an apogee kick, which is burning at the highest altitude just to totally circularize ourselves and put us into orbit. And voila, a perfect orbit-ish. That's fantastic. Now we release the satellite And we're good space stewards, so we're going to go ahead and deorbit the stage as well, and it will burn up on re-entry. Nice and easy. There we go. Okay, well that was honestly the perfect rocket for the job. It could just barely get that 1 metric ton up into space and have just a little bit of fuel margins remaining to deorbit itself. It's perfect. It was a perfect fit. Okay, so I know what we're thinking. Let's go ahead and turn this into a single stage to orbit rocket. So first things first, let's strip it of anything that was necessary for the second stage. So let's go ahead and take off that expensive RL-10 upper stage engine. We don't need that anymore. And we don't need any of the interstage hardware either. So let's go ahead and take all this stuff off here. And goodbye. We're going to attach this back up. Well, we need to put those thrusters back down on there. And now we need to make sure we replace all the fuel that was hydrogen for that upper stage with RP1, which is the same fuel for the first stage engine. And voila, now we have about 7,155 meters per second. Let's see what this thing can do. Alright, so we've got our first version of our SSTO with the upper stage removed, ready for launch. Let's do this. 3, 2, 1, hip hip. And there we go. Let's go ahead and just kind of fast forward this a little bit. And not bad, not bad. How far is this thing going to make it? I'm very curious here. And ditch the fairings. We'll coast up. We're at that 250,000 meters of an altitude. We're going to do an apogee kick here. And we're out of fuel, and that's all the further we made it. What? Yeah, we only had a tiny little drip of fuel left over after all that. And that's all the further our satellite's going to make it, about a third of the way into the Atlantic Ocean. Let's try and go bigger. Let's add enough fuel so it can actually get into orbit. Okay, so I know what we're thinking. Let's just add some fuel, right? We're at 7,155 meters per second. We got to get that up to that around 9,300 meters per second. So let's just start stretching these tanks, shall we? So I'm just going to click here and we're going to edit this. And we're just going to make this tank taller.
Greetings,
A lot
survivor.
taller, right? A lot taller. We're just going to keep going here. A lot taller. I'm going to be here for a while clicking. A lot taller. Well, I'm tired of doing this. Let's go ahead and stop at 602 meters tall. We're gonna need a new VAB. We absolutely smashed the roof of this thing. This thing looks pretty cool though. Let's go ahead and load this up. Yes! It loaded! And it's not tipping over for now. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. 600 meters tall. And by the way, guys, we only have 8,800 meters per second delta V. We still don't even have enough delta V to get ourselves into orbit. And I think there's one other problem well, besides the fact that it's insanely tall, I think there's one other thing you might realize. Oh. What? It just blew up on the pad. Oh, that's like the dumbest pencil lead thing ever. Look at that. Alright, let's try and launch this anyway. I think we know what's going to happen here, don't we? Even though we only have 8,800 meters per second delta V, it's going to be way too low thrust to even remotely take off. And there we go. It just blows up on the pad as soon as you kind of let it go. So the thrust to weight ratio was way too low with that single engine. And even with that single engine, so let's see, the thrust to weight ratio is about 0.05, and you need above a 1.0 in order to actually start lifting off. So 0.05. So we'd have to add, what is that, 20 more of those engines? And we still didn't even have enough fuel to get it into space. Let's see what it will take to actually get this thing into space. Alright, so I've got an idea. Why don't we basically just do like a Falcon 9 first stage booster, shall we? So let's go ahead and first things first, stretch these tanks out quite a bit. Because remember, the Falcon 9 first stage booster is about 45 meters tall. And then we're going to need 8 more of those Merlin 1D engines. And blah, 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 better avionics, etc., etc. Snazzy this up just a little bit. And what are we at here? We ended up with 8,308 meters per second. So still 1,000 meters per second under what we need to do. And now we have literally the first stage of a Falcon 9. I can't help but think that's going to be a lot more expensive. We have 9 Merlin engines instead of 1 Merlin engine and then 1 RL-10 engine. So all of a sudden we have instead of 2 engines, we have 9. We stretched the tank from about 17 meters for that first stage. Altogether, the whole thing was, what, 38 meters? And now we're sitting at, 45, 50 meter tall rocket that's way wider, way bigger, and we still are going to fall up short. Let's launch it anyway, just to show you. And 3, 2, 1, hip, hip. And again, I'm just going to speed it up here real quick. And guess what? Look, just like that, guess what happened? We didn't have enough fuel. Even with our apogee kick there, we ended up 893.1 meters per second short of orbital velocity. We're out of fuel. There's nothing we can do now. And look, we still didn't even make it to the coast of Africa either. So we made it about 2/3 the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And we just threw away an entire Falcon 9 first stage booster, basically. I don't get it. I would much rather have a small 2-stage rocket than a massive 1-stage rocket that can't even perform work. And to be honest, without tweaking the variables like tank utilization or using some advanced future technology like an aerospike engine, I actually can't get this to work in Kerbal Space Program at all. Alright, so I guess SSTO rockets don't really work out too well. The math just doesn't really add up. Darn you, Silkovsky! So I can already hear you over there saying, but, and that first but is probably, but Elon Musk said the Falcon 9 booster could reach orbital velocities. Sure it can. Now good job. You just put a $30 million piece of hardware up in space where it has no spare margin to carry anything more than a small backpack and no remaining fuel to re-enter or land. I think there's better ways to put a backpack in space. And again, Elon said that the BFS, the spaceship portion of the big Falcon rocket, is capable of reaching orbit by itself with a low payload, but using the booster, it can deliver more than an order of magnitude more payload. Well, first off, it would require firing the 4 vacuum Raptor engines at sea level, which Elon says I wouldn't recommend. But okay, combustion instability aside, let's pretend it could put 15 tons into orbit and somehow have enough margins to deorbit and safely land. So now we flew a BFS to space and back so it could deliver something smaller than a Falcon 9 could deliver. The cost of the range, the personnel, and of course the refurbishment of the ship need to be in consideration. Okay, so now let me ask you this. Wouldn't it just be better to fuel up the booster too? And since the booster experiences much less re-entry heat than the upper stage, it can be flown a lot more without maintenance or refurbishment costs. So why not utilize the entire vehicle? In the best case scenario, you just launched 1/10 the payload capacity just to save a little on gas money. Once an entire vehicle is routinely, rapidly, and reliably reusable, that's a lot of R's. Then who cares if it's 1 stage or 2? So in best case scenario, 2 stages is better than 1, and in worst case scenario, 1 stage doesn't even work at all. Okay, but let's not be all poo-poo here. Let's take a look at some SSTO designs past, present, and future to see if there's anything that seems promising. Let's start off with some previously proposed and pursued SSTOs and look at why they failed. Well, one of the earliest proposals was the 1-stage orbital space truck, or OOST, by Phil Bono of Douglas Space in the 1960s. Later, he proposed a reusable version called ROOST, or Roost. Another proposal from the 60s was the Nexus rocket, which would have been freaking huge. I'm talking insanely big. It would have been 122 meters or 400 feet tall with a width of 50 meters or 164 feet. Holy moly, that is huge. Okay, so paper rockets are one thing, but how about a rocket that was actually being tested? Look no further than the DCX or Delta Clipper experimental, made by McDonnell Douglas. The DCX was an actual working 1/3 scale prototype of a proposed DCY SSTO that was to be capable of putting about 1,300 kilograms or 3,000 pounds into orbit. The DCX was just to demonstrate vertical takeoff and landing, and actually flew 8 times between August 1993 and July 1995, and pretty successfully. But it only reached a maximum altitude of 2,500 meters. Think of it kind of like SpaceX's Grasshopper. In 1996, NASA took the program and turned it into the DCX-A, which made some improvements to the vehicle. It flew 4 times, including a 26-hour turnaround and setting a new altitude record of 3,140 meters or 10,300 feet. Its last flight was July 7, 1996, after landing strut failed to extend and a LOX tank leaked, causing a fire and damaging the vehicle. Despite a relatively low cost to repair and continue working, NASA canceled the program and looked to pursue Lockheed Martin's Venture Star. Let's talk about that. Venture Star is probably one of my all-time favorite spacecraft designs. See? I don't hate SSTOs. Lockheed Martin proposed a space shuttle replacement in the mid-90s and received funding from the US government to work on its development. The Venture Star ticked all the SSTO boxes. It would have been amazing, and it actually got painfully close to flying. Well, at least a subscale, suborbital version. But here's the rundown. It had advanced carbon fiber construction, a giant linear aerospike engine that could take 20,000 kilograms or 45,000 pounds to LEO. That's close to a Falcon 9. It would take off vertically like a rocket and land horizontally, just like the space shuttle. Unfortunately, the subscale X-33 demonstrator was canceled in 2001, despite being really close to flying. The X-33 demonstrator had 96% of its parts manufactured and was 85% assembled, and even its launch facility was complete. The reason for its cancellation was a long series of technical difficulties, flight instability, and excess weight. Darn you, weight! Next, how about maybe the craziest proposed SSTO of all time, the Roton. This thing is hilarious. This is a helicopter that could get to orbit, supposedly. It basically was a helicopter powered by jet tips. So some small thrusters at the end of the rotors. It would then lift itself off using low-powered jet tips spinning the helicopter rotors until the atmosphere got too low, where it then light up a rocket engine and ascend to orbit using the rocket engine. But the cool thing is, the rotors weren't just dead weight once in space either. Instead of providing lift, they would continue spinning to power the turbo pump for the rocket engine. Then, they would also be used to slow down through descent in the atmosphere and used to land softly. Apparently, it was horribly unstable when flying like a helicopter. Actually, the vehicle was found to be unflyable by anyone except the test pilots, who even then had periods of being completely out of control. Yikes. Despite a full-scale atmospheric test vehicle being built and flying, well, sort of, the program was canceled in 2001 due to lack of funding and people saying the technology wasn't valid, and it was technically impossible on available technology. But I still love that wacky thing. It's straight up ridiculous. Okay, so what about some current proposals? It's been more than a decade since those last proposals ended. There's gotta be some new technology we can apply and make these things happen, right? Well, you can't talk about SSTOs without talking about perhaps the most alluring SSTO, the Skylon spaceplane. The Skylon is being designed by the United Kingdom's Reaction Engines Limited and utilizes an amazing combined cycle hybrid rocket engine called the Sabre engine. Now, this is the one concept I can sort of get behind. The Skylon Sabre engine acts like a fairly traditional jet engine. It uses the atmosphere to its advantage. Instead of a traditional rocket that tries to get out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible by ascending virtually straight up for a minute or so, the Skylon will reach 5 times the speed of sound, or around 6,000 kilometers or 3,800 miles per hour, while pulling in oxygen from the atmosphere, just like any other jet. And unlike a traditional rocket, the Skylon can scoop up oxygen during ascent through the atmosphere. Then, when it switches to the closed-cycle rocket engine, it uses onboard liquid oxygen. So it doesn't need to carry nearly as much liquid oxygen, another huge weight savings advantage. The Sabre engine has received even further funding from the United States' DARPA, Boeing, and Rolls-Royce, to build a high-temperature test facility, which hopefully will begin testing this year. So the Skylon actually has some promise. But even though it's technically, theoretically possible, Reaction Engines is currently pursuing non-SSTO vehicles first, much before the Skylon will ever fly. In 2017, Mark Thomas of Reaction Engines said they're currently pursuing a spaceplane as a two-stage vehicle where it would deploy an upper stage at a high altitude and a high velocity, and then the spaceplane would turn around and land. And one more thing while we're talking about the Skylon. Remember the SR-71 Blackbird? Even though it could only reach Mach 3, it still experienced so much heat that it needed to have large gaps in its body panels, since it expanded by 60 centimeters when flying at speed. This led to it basically peeing its pants and dripping fuel when fully fueled on the runway. Now, can you imagine something that goes even faster in the atmosphere? Well, this is the 21st century after all. I don't think the Skylon will pee its pants on the runway, but the crazy high heat at high Mach speeds in the atmosphere might be a huge hurdle. I personally foresee there being many fairly substantial issues to overcome in making the Skylon actually work. It'll be amazing if it does, but for now, it's kind of stuck in that future hopes and dreams category to me. If you want me to do more about the Skylon, let me know. We could probably do a whole video on it. It's a really cool vehicle. And lastly, we should probably mention Arca Space's Haas-2CA. This to me is pretty silly. It's an SSTO rocket with a linear aerospike engine. Cool, but it's only capable of 100 kilograms or 220 pounds to orbit. Maybe they should just add a small upper stage to that thing, so we can maybe put 1,000 kilograms in orbit, since they're throwing the whole thing away anyway. My big question for Arca is, why? What's the point? The only thing they claim that's an advantage is they can launch inland, because there are no spent stages to fall on populated areas. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, yay for aerospikes, but boo for a rocket with such a limited capability. Okay, so all past SSTOs have failed. All current SSTOs are either not going to be SSTOs or are kind of pointless in my opinion. And there really isn't much on the table for a usable SSTO in the near future without some major breakthrough in material science or propulsion. But wait, there's one more thing. So far I'm here talking all about how SSTOs fail. That's not true. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous spacecraft in all of history was an SSTO, the Lunar Excursion Module. Of course it could do single stage to orbit, but only on the moon. The LEM was capable of achieving lunar orbit with only one stage, but of course that's the moon. The moon's gravity is so much weaker than Earth's gravity, and there's no atmosphere to fight against either. And then we have SpaceX's BFS, which will not only be capable of SSTO from the surface of Mars, but even have enough performance to get all the way back to Earth from the surface of Mars in one stage. Again, this is mostly due to Mars having only 38% the amount of gravity of Earth and having only 1% the atmosphere, making achieving orbit much, much easier. So maybe SSTOs don't suck. Maybe Earth sucks. It has just enough gravity to barely make it possible to achieve orbit with rocket engines, and it has that pesky atmosphere, which slows vehicles down on ascent too. I still stand by the fact that as cool as SSTOs are, and as much as I do actually love them, they just don't really work in practice using currently available technology. Of course, I'm not saying that's how it'll always be, but for now, give me them stages. After all, I think we can all agree that the most important aspect of an SSTO is the reusability thing. So what if a multi-stage rocket is fully reusable, like the BFR? Isn't that what matters most? The first stage does what it needs to do, then comes back and is refueled and reused. Same with the upper stage. So who cares if the vehicle does it in one piece or breaks off into two more dedicated pieces? You can almost think of the booster stage of a rocket as a giant catapult or something, sending off a brand new fresh rocket, giving it extra velocity and altitude, then it just comes back and lands. I think that's awesome. I can't wait for a day when orbital flight is routine and reliable and fully reusable. And the foreseeable future, I think it'll continue to be done with stages. So what do you think? Do you think SSTOs are still valid and practical, or are you on team multi-stage? Team Mormons. Let me know your thoughts on SSTOs in the comments below. And please, spare me your Kerbal SSTO designs. It works in Kerbal Space Program is not a real argument, unfortunately. And before you tell me all about how SSTOs can take off and land on runways, remember, that's not exclusive to SSTOs. That's an air launcher and or lifting body advantage. That is not exclusive to SSTOs. But other than that, let me know if you have any other questions or things you want me to cover in future videos. As always, I owe a huge thanks to my Patreon supporters for helping make this and other Everyday Astronaut content possible. I owe a super special thanks to those patrons in our exclusive Discord channel and our exclusive subreddit for helping me script and research. We had quite the debate about SSTOs. If you want to help contribute, please visit patreon.com/everydayastronaut. Don't forget to check out my web store for shirts, hats, mugs, prints of rocket launches or original artwork, and lots of other fun stuff at everydayastronaut.com/shop. As always, all the music in my videos is original. Feel free to check it out at soundcloud.com/everydayastronaut. Tell a friend. Thanks everybody, that does it for me. I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, bringing space down to Earth.
In 1985, one of the most audacious space rescue missions was launched by the Soviets to recover a space station that had been dead for months due to an unknown fault. That feat was unparalleled in space exploration and rewrote the books on what was thought possible, and yet its story has fallen into obscurity and conspiracy theory. In 1979, the Soviet Union was a superpower in search of a space station. Mir, the state-of-the-art orbital facility, was in development but was delayed and still 6 years from launch. And also, the military space station Almaz had also recently been cancelled without its final mission taking place. To maintain a presence in low Earth orbit, the Soviet Space Agency took the decision to fly one more single launch station. That's a small space station that can be lifted into orbit, complete in one launch. The backup hardware for the Salyut program could be used, and a series of missions was planned for the station that would become known as Salyut 7. This small lab orbiting 200 kilometers or 120 miles above the Earth would go further than any spacecraft before to become the base for 6 long-term expeditions. But Salyut 7 would also suffer from a series of strange malfunctions and become the scene of a desperate rescue at orbital velocity. The space race of the 60s and 70s was measured by a growing number of competitive record-breaking missions. In the Soviet media, new achievements were needed to justify the expense of the space program and bolster national pride. To feed this hunger, cosmonauts spent longer and longer in their capsules on spacewalks and then inhabiting manned space stations. The American Skylab, constructed from an adapted Saturn V upper stage, spent 84 days in orbit in 1973-74, testing the effects of microgravity on the body and pioneering solar observations. In 1978, the Soviet Salyut 6 exceeded the long-standing Skylab record when its crew passed 96 days in orbit. And by 1980, that record had been extended to 184 days of uninterrupted habitation. With the upcoming Mir, the Soviets planned to do more than had ever been possible with single launch stations. Salyut 7 could help make this a reality by testing out new hardware and training cosmonauts. As with its predecessors, Salyut 7 had the docking ports fore and aft, so crew rotation and resupply could happen simultaneously. Salyut had previously been supplied by the Progress spacecraft, a derivative of Soyuz that still travels to the International Space Station to this day. Salyut 7 launched aboard a Proton rocket on the 19th of April 1982, and on May the 13th, the first crew launched to rendezvous with it, beginning a mission that would last for a record-breaking 211 days. The first task aboard the new station was to launch a 28 kilogram or 61 pound amateur radio satellite from the trash airlock. This was hailed by the Soviets as the first launch of a communications satellite from a manned space vehicle, before NASA's planned launch of 2 heavy geostationary satellites from the shuttle later that year. Despite a successful first year, research on Salyut 7 was soon stalled by technical issues. In September 1983, a fuel leak was discovered after almost a whole tank vented into space. In a series of spacewalks, cosmonauts conducted 2 in-orbit repairs and a later repair with a special tool delivered by Ground Resupply. The unprecedented scale of these repairs was impressive, but Salyut 7 faced a much greater challenge ahead. In 1984, Salyut 7's third cosmonaut crew returned from orbit aboard Soyuz, and the space station entered autopilot mode, monitored by remote control from the Soviet ground team. On the 11th of February 1985, telemetry reported a huge electrical surge, knocking out the radio transmission from Salyut. When ground operators attempted to bring the transmitters back online, a second surge swept through the station, knocking out the radio receivers as well. Now, suddenly, Salyut 7 was out of contact, with no way of diagnosing what may have gone wrong. For months in 1985, the 16-metre or 50-foot long station drifted, silent and out of control. According to a Russian documentary program made in 2012, the Americans considered trying to capture the Salyut 7 with the space shuttle's cargo bay and bring it back to Earth. In reality, Soviet ground control had considered doing the same thing with the unfinished Buran shuttle, but they had found it would have been impossible. Although the Salyut couldn't be scooped up and carried back to Earth, it was far too valuable to just be abandoned. Instead, the only solution was to send up a Soyuz with a 2-man crew, consisting of Vladimir Zarybekov and Viktor Sedin, to manually dock with Salyut 7 and attempt a rescue. The first problem was, how do you dock with a dead space station that uses an automatic powered docking system? The engineers had to come up with an entirely new set of docking techniques. The Soyuz was a 3-man craft, but with just 2 crew, the third seat and the automatic docking system removed completely, there was enough room for extra supplies, food and water, and more fuel for the extended mission. The Soyuz was fitted with a laser rangefinder, and the crew took night vision goggles in case they had to dock on the night side. With a 70 to 80% chance of success, the mission was given the go-ahead goggles in case they had to dock on the night side. With a 70 to 80% chance of success, the mission was given the go-ahead. On the 6th of June 1985, the rescue mission launched and orbited for 2 days until it caught up with Salyut 7. As the Soyuz approached more closely, it appeared that the solar panels were misaligned. That meant that the electrical systems had failed completely. Using the laser rangefinder to align with the docking port, the crew matched the rotation of their craft to the salute and then approached slowly to contact and dock. This was a major achievement, but significant danger lay ahead. Neither the crew nor the ground control knew what had caused the station to go dark or what lay in wait for them inside. As the cosmonauts opened up the hatches to equalize the air pressure of the station, they felt a rush of freezing air. With Salute's power being offline for so long, it had been exposed to temperatures it had never been designed to operate in. Critical provisions like water were all frozen, and any number of essential life support systems might have been damaged. Ground control weren't even sure if it was safe for the crew to be on board. Dressed in winter clothing, the cosmonauts slowly went through the process of opening the 3 hatches that stood between them and the dark living area of the station. With handheld air quality tests, they quickly checked for carbon monoxide and other dangerous gases that could indicate a fire on board. The problems of the station were electrical in nature, but they couldn't just hotwire the station to the Soyuz. The fault that took down the space station could also blow the electrics in the Soyuz, and then they would be stranded and face almost certain death. Although the air supply was safe, they were limited to just 1 crew member at a time working in the station, because with no circulation systems working, the carbon dioxide from the crew member's own breath could build up to dangerous levels. So 1 crew member stayed in the Soyuz to monitor the other one working in the station. Water was also a problem. The crew had 8 days supply in the Soyuz. If they rationed it and tapped into the Salute's emergency supply, it would stretch to 12 days. But it could take that time or longer to find the cause of the problem and get the station's systems back online. If the water ran out before then, they would have to leave come what may. After carefully working through the Salute's electrical systems, the cause of the power loss was eventually pinpointed to a single sensor on one of the batteries. This malfunctioning sensor was designed to stop the batteries from being overcharged. Once a day, every day, the main computer instructed the solar cells to charge the batteries, but the faulty sensor stopped charging almost immediately. Over time, the batteries ran flat and soon the whole station went dead, unable to communicate with the ground or function at all. Once the crew had replaced the battery and the faulty sensor, and further adjustments to the out-of-alignment solar cells were made, in August, Salute 7 was saved and continued to support missions for a further year. After the station was returned to service, Vladimir Dzhangbekov remained on the station for a total of 110 days. Mir was launched in February 1986, but even with its replacement in orbit, Salute 7 continued to make history. The first crew on Mir travelled in the Soyuz to Salute to collect and transfer valuable equipment, the only time that a station-to-station crew transfer has taken place to date. The Soviets had intended to continue using Salute 7 even after the launch of Mir. It was boosted into a higher orbit of 475 kilometers or 295 miles to delay re-entry. However, due to the funding cuts for future Salute missions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the non-appearance of the Buran shuttle, the station's orbit gradually decayed, and in 1991, 3 years earlier than intended, the last Salute broke up during an uncontrolled re-entry over South America. It's this determination and experience of the engineers, ground control and cosmonauts to keep Salute 7 flying when previous stations that had gone before were allowed to fail that has been carried over into the ISS, which has now been flown continuously for over 15 years by the international community. So thanks for watching, and don't forget we now have the Curious Droid Facebook page and group where you can suggest ideas for new videos. The link is in the channel page. And you can also translate any of the videos with the community contributions, which we have a video on if you're unsure in the uploaded video section. So, as always, thanks again for watching, and please subscribe, rate and share.